The rain fell soft across the moor, thin and cold, hushing the heather. A car crept down a narrow lane, its headlamps dim in the mist. Inside, a young woman gripped a small torch. Beside her, a man drove without speaking. The year was 1965. The place was Saddleworth, in the north of England, where peat lay black beneath the grass, and the wind carried the smell of wet earth and old stone. A spade rattled in the boot. A camera lay wrapped in cloth on the back seat. The moor stretched wide and silent, older than the road, older than the towns below. Somewhere in the dark, a curlew cried once and fell still, and beneath the soaked heather, in ground softened by the autumn rain, the first small grave was waiting. The quiet streets of Gorton. Good evening and welcome. This is the Bedside Historian. The night has grown quiet now, and the world outside your window has softened. Wherever you are, and whatever hour glows upon the clock beside you, you are welcome here. Take a moment before we begin. Tell me, in your own quiet way, where you are listening from tonight. Perhaps a small town lit by street lamps. Perhaps a wide city humming softly through the dark. Perhaps a bedroom warm with the last light of the day. Whatever the place and whatever the hour, know that others are listening with you from many corners of the earth. Before the story begins, please take a small moment to subscribe to the Bedside Historian. A single tap upon the button helps this channel grow and helps these old stories reach the ears that need them. A gentle press upon the like button, a kind word left below, all of these help the channel more than words can hold. Now, let the light dim. Let the day fall away. And let history open its long, quiet page. The story begins in Manchester, in the north of England, in the years after the Second Great War. It is a city of red brick and blackened stone. Its chimneys still smoke against a grey sky. Its trams still rattle down long, straight streets. The war is over, but the ruin remains. Whole rows of houses stand hollow, their windows blown out, their roofs open to the rain. Children play in the bomb sites. They climb the broken walls and chase each other through the rubble, as if the ruin were only another kind of playground. To the east of the city stands a district called Gorton. It is a place of narrow streets and cobblestones, of small terraced houses joined in long, straight rows. Their chimneys share the same soot. Their doorsteps share the same stone. The gas lamps at their corners hiss softly in the evening. From the chapels, on Sundays, the bells fall over the rooftops. From the mills, on weekdays, the whistles call the workers to their long shifts. The air of Gorton has a taste of its own. It is the taste of coal, of damp brick, of boiled potatoes and cabbage. It is the smell of wet washing on a line strung across the alley. It is the sound of a kettle on a black iron stove and the click of clogs upon the pavement. In these streets the poor live close together. They know each other's steps upon the flagstones. They know each other's voices through the thin walls. In the summer of 1942, in a small hospital in Crumpsall, a girl was born to a young mother named Hindley. The baby's father, Bob, was away at the war. He was a soldier of the parachute regiment, hard-drinking and hard-fisted, with a scar across his face and a temper that never fully cooled. The child was named Myra. She was fair-haired and quiet, with a wide, watchful face. The Hindley family lived in a small house on Eaton Street in Gorton. It was a two-up, two-down, like every other on the row. The front door opened onto the pavement. The back door opened onto a little yard with an outdoor privy and a coal shed. In the parlour stood a horsehair sofa and a wireless set on a wooden shelf. In the kitchen stood a stone sink and a mangle for the wet clothes. The rooms were cold in winter. Frost feathered the inside of the windows, and the children slept beneath layers of old coats. Not long after little Myra learned to walk, another daughter arrived. Her name was Maureen. The house grew smaller. Money grew tighter. Bob Hindley had come back from the war, but not whole. He drank in the pubs of Bellevue and Openshaw. He came home late, and sometimes his hand fell heavy upon those closest to him. Hetty tried to keep the peace. She scrubbed the front step each morning until it shone. She stood in queues at the butcher and the baker with her ration book in her hand. When Myra was about 4 years old, the strain in the little house grew too great. A small decision was made, spoken softly between the mother and the grandmother. Myra would move a few streets away, to the home of her grandmother, Ellen Maybury. The child was told it was only for a while. In truth, it would last for years. Bannock Street was only a short walk from Eaton Street, but to a small child it felt like another country. The house on Bannock Street was old and low, with a coal fire that burned all winter, and a small yard behind. Grandmother Maybury was a widow, grey-haired and gentle, who kept the house neat and warm. She loved the child, and spoiled her a little, and let her sit close to the fire in the long evenings. Yet the small girl still walked back to Eaton Street each day. She still saw her sister Maureen there. She still stood in the doorway when her father shouted. She grew up between two houses, neither one entirely her own. In Gorton in those years, life for a child was made of small, simple things. It was the sound of the milk cart in the early morning, the horses' hooves upon the stones. It was the taste of a penny bag of sweets from the corner shop, black bullets and pear drops and sherbet lemons. It was the smell of chip fat rising from a paper cone, salt and vinegar warm in the hand. It was the ring of church bells on a Sunday morning, calling the families in their best coats to St. Francis's Monastery on Gorton Lane. Myra attended Peacock Street School as a small girl. She wore a grey pinafore and heavy black shoes. She walked to school in all weathers, her hair combed flat and neat by her grandmother's hand. Her teachers found her bright but quiet. She could recite her tables in a clear, steady voice. She could copy long lines of neat handwriting into her exercise book. She was fond of her friends. She loved to swim at the public baths, and she would later save a small child from drowning. In the eyes of Gorton, she was a good girl, sensible and helpful. Yet even then, something in her seemed to sit apart. She was watchful. She held her thoughts back. She was slow to laugh in the open way that other children did. When her small friend Michael Higgins drowned in a reservoir in the summer of 1957, the loss struck her with a force she did not seem to know how to hold. She stood at the graveside in her Sunday coat, dry-eyed, tight-mouthed. Some who knew her said the girl who came back from that funeral was not quite the girl who had gone. She turned toward the Catholic Church for a time. She took her first communion at St. Francis's. She wore a small white veil and a white gown, and she carried a plain white missal in her gloved hands. Later she would write in a diary about her love for the priests and the candles and the smell of incense. For a while, the church was the calm centre of her small world. Then, slowly, it too fell away. While Myra Hindley was walking to school in Gorton, another child, far to the north, was growing up in a very different place. His name was Ian Duncan Stewart, though he would one day take another name. He had been born in Glasgow in the winter of 1938. His mother was a young waitress named Peggy Stewart. His father was a journalist, though the child would never know him. In the eyes of that hard, respectable city, the boy had come into the world beneath a heavy shadow. He was, in the plain and cruel word of the time, illegitimate. His young mother could not keep him. In the poor streets of the Gorbals, she worked long hours to keep a roof above her head. When the boy was but a few months old, she gave him into the care of a family called Sloane. They were a decent, chapel-going couple in a tenement in Pollock, with children of their own. They loved him as if he were their own son. They called him Ian Sloane. They taught him his letters. They fed him at their table. On Sundays they sat with him in the small kirk. Yet even as a small boy, Ian was different from the other children. He was quiet, watchful, and quick to burn with anger. He did not care for games. He did not care for other children's laughter. He kept to himself in corners, reading, drawing, thinking. He liked to catch flies and pull the wings from them. He liked to burn small things with a magnifying glass in the summer sun. The Sloanes were troubled, but they told themselves he would grow out of it in time. The Gorbals in those years was a place of great hardship. Whole families lived in single rooms. Wet washing hung from tenement windows. Rats ran in the shared closes. The air smelled of coal smoke and the slow, grey river. Ian grew up on these narrow streets. He fought with other boys. He was clever at his lessons. His teachers praised his neat hand and his sharp memory. Yet again and again he was in trouble. He was caught stealing. He appeared in the juvenile court. He was placed on probation. By the time he was 16, the courts of Glasgow were tired of him. It was suggested that he leave the city altogether. His birth mother, Peggy, had married a man in Manchester, a market porter named Patrick Brady. They lived in a small house in Moss-side. In the winter of 1954, the boy was put upon a train at Central Station. His foster family stood on the platform with tears in their eyes. The Sloanes had raised him, but the state would let him go no further with them. He was to belong now to the mother he barely knew. He arrived in Manchester with a small suitcase and a dark, unsmiling face. He took his stepfather's surname. From that winter forward, he would be known as Ian Brady. He walked the streets of Moss-side and Longsight, with his hands deep in his pockets. He did not care for his stepfather's kindness. He did not care for the noise of the trams or the church bells. He took work as a labourer, then as a porter at Smithfield Market. He kept to himself. He read strange books late into the night. He hoarded his wages in secret, and he stared long at the smoke rising above the city. So there they were, in the same city, though they did not yet know each other. A quiet girl in a grandmother's kitchen in Gorton. A brooding young man in a back bedroom in Moss-side. She was still a child. He was already something colder. They walked the same streets in different years. They rode the same trams to different stops. They passed one another, perhaps, in the crowded aisles of the Bellevue Market, and neither one turned to look. Above them both, the city carried on with its long grey work. The mills poured their smoke into the sky. The chapels rang their bells on Sundays. The public houses filled at the end of the shift. The washing lines swayed above the yards. Children played hopscotch upon the flagstones and skipping games in the gutters, and the war seemed a little further away with every passing year. It was a hard time, but it was not without kindness. Neighbours shared what little they had. Doors were often left unlocked. In the evenings the old sat upon their front steps and watched the young walk by. Yet in the shadow of that ordinary life, 2 young lives were being shaped in ways that no one could see. In the small house on Bannock Street, a girl grew quieter and quieter behind her steady blue eyes. In the small house in Moss-side, a young man read pages that few in Manchester had read before, and he began to gather in his mind a dark and private world of his own. The chapel bells still rang across the rooftops. The trams still rattled down Hyde Road. The rain still fell soft upon the cobbles of Gorton. And somewhere ahead, in a year that had not yet come, in a small chemical firm on the edge of the city, a young typist would raise her eyes from her ledger and see, for the first time, the pale, unsmiling face of a quiet stock clerk waiting at her counter. A meeting at Millwards. The winter of 1960 came slowly to Manchester. The rain turned to sleet, and the sleet to a thin, low snow. The chimneys of the mills breathed out long trails of grey smoke, and the smoke settled upon the rooftops like a soft, dirty wool. The trams rattled down Hyde Road with their windows fogged. The gas lamps at the street corners burned pale in the early dusk. In the small houses of Gorton, the coal fires glowed red behind their black grates, and the kettles sang upon the hobs. Myra Hindley was 18 years old that winter. She had left school at 15, as most girls of her street had done. She had worked for a time at an electrical firm called Lawrence Scott and Electromotors, where she had learned to type and to file and to answer a telephone in a clear, careful voice. She had worked for a short while at another small office after that. Between one post and the next, she stayed at the little house on Bannock Street with her grandmother, Ellen Maybury, who fed her thick slices of bread and dripping and worried when she came home late from a dance. By that winter, Myra had grown into a tall young woman. She wore her fair hair combed high at the crown and set into a neat back-combed style with a stiff can of lacquer. She painted her lips a pale pink. She wore a wool coat and beneath it a plain dress, and beneath that a strong pair of stockings. Her shoes were black and low-heeled, chosen for the long walk to work through the wet streets. She looked like every other typist in Manchester that winter. She looked, some later said, quite ordinary. She had answered a small advertisement in the Manchester Evening News. A firm called Millwards Merchandising in Gorton required a shorthand typist. The wages were modest but steady. The office was only a short walk from her grandmother's front door. On a cold Monday morning in the January of 1961, she rose in the dark, ate her toast at the small kitchen table, buttoned her coat to the throat, and set out for the interview beneath a low, grey sky. Millwards Merchandising stood on Levenshulme Road, in a plain brick building near the railway. It sold chemicals to small firms across the north, powders and dyes and cleaning agents packed into paper sacks and tin drums. The office was upstairs, above the warehouse. A wooden staircase led up from the yard. Inside there was a small reception, a few plain desks, a row of green filing cabinets, and the steady clatter of a manual typewriter. The air smelled of ink, of pipe tobacco, and faintly, from below, of the chemicals in their sacks. Myra was offered the post at £4.10 a week. She accepted with a small, polite nod. She was told she would sit at a desk near the window. She would type invoices and letters, keep the ledger tidy, and take her turn at the small kettle for the office tea. She was told that a young man named Brady was the stock clerk, and that he was quiet, and that she should not mind him if he did not always speak. On her first morning of work, she climbed the wooden staircase and stepped into the office in her best dress. She hung her coat upon a peg and sat at the small desk near the window. The typewriter before her was a black Underwood, heavy as a small anvil. She fed a sheet of paper into its roller and began her day. Her fingers moved across the keys in a steady rhythm. The bell rang at the end of each line. The carriage returned with a firm shove of her hand. At the far end of the office, half hidden by a filing cabinet, sat the stock clerk. He was a young man of about 22, thin and pale, with a long face and slow, careful movements. His hair was dark and slicked back from a high forehead. His eyes were a light, cool blue. He wore a plain white shirt, a narrow tie, and a dark suit with the trousers pressed to a sharp line. He read a book upon his lap when the manager was not looking. He spoke only to say what needed to be said. When Myra was introduced to him, he looked up for a moment, gave the smallest nod, and returned to his ledger. His name was Ian Brady. He had been at Millwards for some time already. He had come to the firm from another dull post in the city. He was known among the clerks for his silences and for his cold, exact way of counting stock. He kept a neat book of numbers. He never made an error. He never joined in the laughter at tea break. He never spoke of his family or his lodgings. He read strange books at his desk, though he kept them turned face down when the manager passed. Some in the office thought him rude. Others thought him only shy. Most soon left him to himself. Myra, in those first weeks, tried to draw him out with small, polite words. She would say good morning as she hung her coat. She would offer him a cup of tea when the kettle boiled. She would ask him a small question about a ledger entry or a filing note. He would answer in a flat, quiet voice, and then his eyes would drop back to his page. He did not smile. He did not tease. He did not join in the small jokes of the office. To all outward eyes, he seemed to take no notice of her at all. Yet Myra took a great deal of notice of him. From the very first week, she began to write of him in a small diary she kept in the drawer of her bedside table. She wrote of the way he read at his desk. She wrote of the shape of his mouth. She wrote of a small song he sometimes hummed under his breath as he worked. She wrote of the way his hands moved across the ledger, thin and pale, with the pen held very still between his fingers. She was, in the plain word of the time, taken with him. She was not the only one in the office who had noticed him. The other typists thought him a strange, cold fish. They said he never bought a round in the pub. They said he read foreign words at lunch. One of them called him, half in jest, the German. Another said he was probably a spy for the manager. Myra did not laugh at their small jokes. She kept her thoughts to herself, tucked away like the folded pages of her diary. Winter turned to spring in the city. The rain grew warmer. The soot upon the windows was washed a shade lighter by the April showers. In the yards of Gorton, women beat their carpets against the fences, and the smell of coal smoke gave way, a little, to the smell of blossom in the small back gardens. On the buses, girls in headscarves read The Woman's Own. On the corners, boys in narrow ties whistled at the passing typists. Still, in the small office at Millwards, Ian Brady did not turn his eyes to Myra. Still, in the small diary at Bannock Street, Myra wrote of him and of him alone. She wrote of her hope that he might notice her one day. She wrote of her fear that he never would. She wrote of the way he looked in his dark suit when he crossed the yard to the warehouse. She wrote of the way he closed his ledger with a small, final snap at the end of the day. Months passed. The days grew long. The evenings smelled of chip fat and privet hedges. Whitsuntide came and went. In the summer, the office windows were pushed open, and the sound of shunting trains drifted in from the yard. Still, Ian Brady kept his silence. Still, Myra Hindley waited. She began to change herself, quietly, in ways she thought he might notice. She dyed her fair hair a lighter shade of blonde, then a paler, silver blonde, then, after a small mishap, a pale, brittle white. She wore darker skirts and higher heels. She read the small books of poetry that the girls in the office passed among themselves. She saved her wages for a new coat and a new pair of stockings. Her grandmother, watching her at the kitchen table, was proud of the young lady she was becoming. Her mother, when she came round for tea, was less easy in her mind. The autumn came. The leaves turned in Bellevue Park. The trams filled with damp coats and folded umbrellas. In November, at a small firm's dance in Levenshulme, Ian Brady spoke to her at last. He spoke without warmth, without the small, tender words that other young men used. He asked her plainly if she would care to go to the pictures with him. She said yes. Their first true evening out fell just before Christmas of 1961. Brady took her, on a cold December night, to a cinema in the city centre. The film he chose was Judgment at Nuremberg. It was a long, slow picture, dark and heavy with the images of a great trial. Row upon row of grave faces filled the screen. Long speeches turned upon guilt and cruelty and the ruin of nations. It was not a film that other young men took their girls to. It was not a film that most young women wished to see. Brady sat in his seat with his hands folded upon his knees. He watched the screen without moving. He did not offer his arm. He did not whisper in her ear. He watched, and he thought his own thoughts, and when the picture ended, he asked her, in his quiet voice, what she had made of it. She answered as best she could, uncertain of what he wished to hear. He seemed pleased. He walked her home through the cold streets of Gorton. At the door of her grandmother's house, he touched her gloved hand and turned into the dark. From that night on, they walked out together. They went to the pictures. They rode upon his motorcycle, a small green Triumph Tiger Cub that he had bought with his careful savings. She sat behind him in a headscarf and a heavy coat, her arms tight around his waist. He drove them out beyond the streets of Manchester, up into the low, dark hills to the east, where the roads narrowed and the villages grew small, and the wide grey shoulders of the moors rose beneath a wet sky. He took her, again and again, to a place called Saddleworth. It was a wide, open country of peat and heather and old stone walls. The wind moved there in a long, low sigh. The clouds hung low above the hills. To Brady, it seemed a place apart from the city and its noise. He would stop the motorcycle upon a stretch of narrow road, and they would stand together at the edge of the moor, and he would speak of how still it was, and how empty, and how far it lay from anyone. She listened. She learned the names of the hills. She learned the small, hidden turnings from the road. She learned, without knowing what she was learning, the shape of a country that would one day close about her name. Back in the city, they returned each morning to Millwards. They sat, as before, at their separate desks. They spoke, before the manager, only of ledgers and invoices. Yet at the end of the day, they walked out together. They caught the same bus. They stood, close and quiet, at the same wet corner. To the girls in the office, the change was plain. To Myra, It was the answer to every line she had written in her diary. She had wanted him. Now, at last, she had him. She wanted more than that. She wanted his mind, his taste, his quiet, private world. She began to read the books he read. She began to speak the small, sharp phrases he spoke. She began to darken her clothes and her voice in slow, small measures. She left the church. She stopped attending the small Catholic services she had once loved. She let the missal in her drawer gather a soft coat of dust. When her grandmother asked, gently, why she no longer went to St. Francis's, she said only that she had lost the feeling for it. In the last months of 1961, and through the long year that followed, she and Brady became a settled pair. He came, at times, to the small house on Bannock Street. He sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea. He spoke politely to Ellen Maybury, who thought him a quiet, respectable young man, and who was glad her granddaughter had found herself a steady lad at last. He carried Myra's coat. He waited at the front step in his neat, dark suit. He seemed, to all outward eyes, a decent match. Yet in his lodgings across the city, Brady kept a room whose walls the old grandmother would never see. There, upon a low shelf, stood a small row of dark books. There, in a locked drawer, lay pamphlets and photographs he did not share with the clerks at Millwards. There, in his quiet evenings alone, he read long into the night, and his mind, cold and careful as his ledger, turned upon thoughts that no one in the office would ever have guessed. He would soon begin to share those books with Myra. He would soon begin to speak, in his soft, exact voice, of what he had read and of what he thought, and of what, he said, the world truly was beneath its Sunday coats. She would listen. She would nod. She would let his words settle upon her, as the soot of the mills settled upon the rooftops of Gorton in a slow and steady grey. Above the streets of Manchester, the winter of 1962 drew near. The lamps burned once more in the early dusk. The chapels rang once more across the yards. The small houses closed their doors against the cold. Upon the low shelf in a rented back room, a row of dark books waited. And along the wet pavements between the office and the door of Bannock Street, a young woman walked home beside a quiet young man and did not yet know how far and how deep his shelves would come to reach. The books on the shelf. I'll generate Chapter 3 following the style guidelines and maintaining continuity. The winter of 1962 came hard across the north. The snow fell thick upon the rooftops of Gorton. The gutters froze in long grey lines. The trams slid a little upon the icy rails, and the horses of the milk carts steamed in the dawn. In the small front rooms of the terraced houses, the coal fires burned red from morning till night. The wireless sets crackled with the news of the day, of the great cold that lay upon Britain, of the pipes that had burst in the schools, of the sheep that had died upon the moors above Saddleworth. Ian Brady rode his motorcycle to work in a long dark coat, with a scarf pulled high about his face. Myra Hindley walked to Millwards in a heavy wool jacket and thick stockings, her breath white upon the still air. In the office, the small electric fire hummed beneath the manager's desk. The typewriters clattered on. The kettle sang a little louder in the cold. At the end of each day the pair left together, close and quiet, and rode out into the frozen streets upon the small green Triumph Tiger Cub. Brady lodged, in that winter, in a rented back room upon Westmoreland Street, in Longsight. It was a narrow house of dark brick, set in a long row much like her own. His landlady kept a clean front parlour and a small brass knocker upon the door. His room lay at the top of the stairs. It held a single bed with a thin blanket, a wooden chair, a small table by the window, and a low shelf built into the wall. Upon that shelf stood the books. He had gathered them slowly, over several years. He had bought them from small shops in the city, from second-hand stalls behind the market, from mail-order lists that came folded in plain brown envelopes. He had bought them with the careful savings of a stock clerk, and he had kept them, from his stepfather and from his workmates, in a private, watchful silence. Upon the top row stood the works he prized above all others. There were the writings of the Marquis de Sade, dark old French pages that spoke of cruelty as if cruelty were a kind of freedom. There were the writings of Friedrich Nietzsche, in cheap English editions, with the pages marked and creased. There were books upon the German Reich, with photographs of uniforms and eagles, of long grey columns marching in the rain. There were books upon the Nuremberg trials, and upon the men who had stood in the dock. There was a slim volume upon Adolf Hitler, thumbed through many times, with certain pages held open by small strips of card. Below these stood the histories of crime. There were the accounts of the poisoners of the last century, of the men who had killed for money in the dark lanes of Victorian cities. There were the writings upon Jack the Ripper, and the pale, grim photographs of the streets of Whitechapel. There were the pamphlets upon the great trials of the North, upon murderers who had been hanged at Strangeways and at Manchester Assizes. There were books upon torture, upon the racks and the wheels of old Europe. There were books upon the great witch hunts, and upon the burnings that had lit the market squares of the German towns. Upon a lower shelf, hidden behind a row of plain paperback thrillers, lay a small stack of magazines. They were of a kind not sold openly in the shops of Manchester. Some had been posted from abroad, in plain wrappers. They held pale, crude photographs, coarse jokes, and cruel stories. Brady had kept them since he had first begun to earn his own money. He did not lend them to the men at the market. He did not speak of them at the office. They lay in his room like a private, folded shadow. Upon the small table by the window, in a dark leather cover, lay a foreign dictionary. It was German. Brady had begun, some years before, to teach himself the language. He worked at it slowly in the evenings, with a pencil in his hand and a scrap of paper beside the book. He copied out long lists of words in his neat, tight script. He wrote them again and again until they held. He spoke them aloud, softly, to the empty room. He liked the sound of them. He liked the hard, exact edges of the words. He had begun to sign small notes to himself in the tongue he was learning. He had begun to write short lines of German verse into the margins of his English books. He had begun to keep, upon a plain sheet of paper, a small list of names and dates from the last great war. It was not the list of a scholar. It was the list of a man who admired what he read. Myra had not, at first, been shown the shelf. In the early months of her walking out with Brady, he had spoken to her only of small, safe things. He had told her of the pictures he wished to see. He had told her of the roads he wished to ride. He had told her of the moor above Saddleworth and of the long, quiet skies above it. He had held her hand upon the bus. He had bought her a small cup of tea in a Lyons cafe near Piccadilly. She had thought him strange and quiet, and hers. The change came slowly, as most such changes do. It came first in the small, sideways sentences he began to drop between other words. He would speak, over a plate of chips, of how the strong took what they wished. He would speak, over a cup of tea, of how kindness was only a mask that the weak wore. He would say, with a small, thin smile, that the world was not what the priests and the schoolmistresses had told her. She would nod. She would laugh a little, at first thinking he was teasing her. He was not teasing her. He began to lend her books. He chose them carefully. He did not begin with the darkest of what he owned. He began with the writings of Dostoevsky, with Crime and Punishment in a plain green paperback. He gave her a book by a Frenchman called Camus. He gave her a book upon Hitler, on which he had marked certain passages with a light pencil line. He watched her, in the office, as she read them at her lunch break. He asked her, upon the bus, what she had made of a certain page. She answered with care. She wished to please him. She read as far as she could, and where she did not understand, she pretended a little. He praised her when she agreed with him. He fell quiet when she did not. He never raised his voice. He never argued. He simply lowered his eyes to his own book and waited. She learned, in a quiet way, that his silence was a punishment. She learned to answer him as he wished to be answered. She learned to nod when he spoke of the strong and the weak. She learned to say, with a small shrug, that perhaps the old rules were only for other people. In the spring of 1963, Ellen Maybury's old house on Bannock Street was pulled down with the rest of the row. The council was clearing the old streets of Gorton for new estates. The Maybury family, and the Hindley family with them, were told they would be moved. The grandmother wept quietly into her tea towel. She had lived in Bannock Street for many long years. The wallpaper of her small parlour had faded above her chair. The stone step at her front door was worn smooth from her scrubbing brush. It was hard to think of leaving it. For a short while the grandmother went to stay with her married daughter. Myra stayed on in a small rented room close by. Brady came to her there. He did not come to a bright, tidy parlour with a coal fire and a plate of biscuits. He came to a plain, small room where a young woman waited for him alone. He brought with him a small case with his own books inside. He read to her in the evenings. He spread photographs upon the narrow bed. He showed her pictures of German soldiers, of camps in a foreign country, of thin, ruined faces behind wire. He told her that these were the true facts of the world. He told her that the men in the fine uniforms had understood what the priests would never say. He told her that most people were sheep, and that a few were wolves, and that the wolves were the only ones who were free. He told her that fear was a small, mean feeling, and that guilt was a chain the churches put upon the necks of the weak. She listened. She let his words settle upon her, one after the other, like the soft grey soot upon the windows. She began, in that spring, to change again in ways others could see. Her clothes grew darker. Her hair, once combed high in a soft blonde crown, was cut shorter and dyed a harder shade. She wore heavy eye paint in the office. She wore boots with high heels and a leather jacket over her plain dress. She stopped attending Mass. She stopped signing her name on the small collection cards passed round the office for weddings and christenings. She grew impatient with the small talk of the other typists. She held her mouth tight when they spoke of babies and boyfriends and dance halls. She began, when she was alone, to read in earnest. She read the books Brady lent her, and then she read them again. She underlined certain lines. She copied out sentences into a small notebook. She learned the names of German towns. She wrote out, in her neat typist's hand, long lists of foreign words. She showed her work to Brady in the evenings. He nodded, and he corrected her, and, once or twice, he touched her hair. At last, in the summer of that year, the council found new places for the Maybury and Hindley families. Myra's grandmother was given a small house upon a fresh council estate, high on a hill above the city, at Hattersley. Myra moved there with her. The estate was new. The bricks were still pale. The lawns were bare mud between the pavements. The house on Wardlebrook Avenue had a small front garden, a narrow hall, a kitchen at the back, and a set of steep stairs to the upper rooms. From the upstairs window one could see the smoke of the city below, and, far off, the low dark shoulder of the moor. Brady came often to Wardlebrook Avenue. He came at first as a suitor, with a small paper of sweets for the old woman. He carried her coal bucket in from the shed. He sat with her by the fire and spoke, in his quiet voice, of small, harmless things. The grandmother liked him. He was polite. He was neat. He did not drink. He did not swear. He was a steady young man in a steady dark suit, and he took an interest in her granddaughter, and that was enough. Brady began, in that year, to leave more of his things at Wardlebrook Avenue. His clothes hung, one by one, upon a peg in the hall. His shaving brush stood in a small mug on the kitchen shelf. And, in time, his books came too. They were carried, in careful bundles tied with string, from the room in Longsight to the small upstairs bedroom in Hattersley. The dark old French pages, the German dictionary, the histories of crime, the photographs, the marked-up volumes upon the Great War. They were placed upon a fresh shelf in a fresh house. The grandmother did not read them. She did not, in truth, read anything at all in the evenings but the small piece in the paper about the weather. Myra now shared her days with Brady more fully than before. In the office at Millwards, they still kept up a careful show. They still sat at their separate desks. They still spoke, before the manager, only of ledgers and letters. But at lunchtime they walked out together to a small cafe near the railway. At the end of the day they rode home together upon the little green motorbike. Upon the weekend they took long rides out into the country. They went again and again to Saddleworth. They walked upon the peat with a small camera in his hand. He began, in that summer, to take photographs of her upon the moor. He posed her upon a slab of dark rock. He asked her to stand upon the heather with the wind in her hair. He carried a spade in the boot of a hired car. He told her, with a small, thin smile, that a hunter must know his ground. He told her that no policeman ever thought to look upon a wide, empty place. He told her that the moor was old, older than the towns below, and that it kept its own quiet. She listened. She smiled a little. She had gone, by then, past the point where she might have pulled back and asked what he truly meant. She had already read too many of his books. She had already written too many of his lines into her small notebook. She had already dyed her hair and shortened her skirt and thrown away her Sunday missal. She had made herself, in slow, small measures, into the woman he wished her to be. In the small house on Wardlebrook Avenue, the coal fire burned in the grate. The old grandmother snored softly in her chair. The wireless played a low tune from the parlour. Upstairs, upon the low new shelf, the dark old books waited in their neat row, and beside them, in a plain leather case, lay a small, cheap camera, freshly loaded with a fresh reel of black and white film, ready for the long light of a summer that had almost run its course. The first missing child. The summer of 1963 came slow and warm to Manchester. The long rains of spring had passed. The chimneys still smoked into the pale sky, but the smoke rose thinner now. The backyards of Gorton were bright with washing lines. The privet hedges gave off a sharp green smell in the dusk. Children played out late upon the pavements. They chalked hopscotch squares in the shade of the alleys. Girls skipped rope beneath the drying sheets. Boys kicked leather footballs against the walls until the last light was gone. On Weil Street in Gorton, in a small terraced house much like the others, lived a family called Reed. The father, Amos, was a baker. He worked the night ovens in a small shop nearby. He came home with flour still on his sleeves and the smell of yeast in his hair. The mother, Joan, kept the house. She scrubbed the front step each morning. She hung the washing on a line strung across the little yard. She fed her family plain meals of stew and bread and tea. The son, Paul, was a quiet lad, fond of his sister. The daughter, Pauline, was 16 years old. Pauline Reed was a bright, cheerful girl with dark hair cut short at the shoulders. She had a soft, round face and a wide, honest smile. She had left school at 15, as most girls of her street had done. She worked at a small confectionery firm called Sharples, packing sweets into paper boxes. Her wages were modest. She gave most of them to her mother and kept a little back for a paper of gumdrops and a ticket to the pictures. She loved to dance. She loved the songs on the wireless. She loved her family and her small, safe corner of the world. On the evening of the 12th of July, a warm Friday, Pauline dressed for a dance. It was to be held at the British Railways Club, only a short walk from Weil Street. She stood at the mirror in her small bedroom and combed her dark hair with slow, careful strokes. She put on a pale pink party dress, sewn at the waist with a small ribbon. She fastened her matching pink shoes with a soft click of the buckles. She dabbed a drop of eau de cologne behind her ears. She looked at herself in the glass and gave a small, nervous smile. She was 16. She was going to a dance. Her mother stood in the doorway. Joan Reed watched her daughter with a warm, tired pride. She said the dress was lovely. She said Pauline looked a proper little lady. She asked, in the quiet way of mothers, whether Pauline was sure she wished to go alone. A friend had dropped out at the last hour. Pauline said she would be fine. It was only a short walk. She would go to the dance, stay a little while, and come home before dark. Her mother nodded, but she did not quite let the worry leave her face. Pauline stepped out onto Weil Street just after 7 o'clock. The evening was warm. The sun still hung low over the rooftops. The trams rattled distant on the Hyde Road. The smell of chip fat drifted from the corner shop. She walked in her pink shoes along the flagstones. She passed the doors of her neighbours. She waved to an old woman who sat on her front step in the last light. She turned onto Froxmore Street and walked on, her small handbag swinging at her side. She had not gone far when a small van drew up beside her. It was a plain Ford Anglia van, hired that day from a garage in the city. At the wheel sat a young woman with pale, back-combed hair. The young woman leaned across and rolled down the passenger window. She spoke in a friendly voice. She asked Pauline if she was going to the dance. Pauline said she was. The young woman said she was sorry to trouble her, but she had lost a glove somewhere upon Saddleworth Moor that afternoon. She said it was a favourite glove. She said it would take only a short while to find it if she had another pair of eyes to help her look. She said she would give Pauline some records afterwards, as a thank you. Pauline hesitated. Her mother had told her never to go with strangers, but the young woman was not a man. She was tidy and neat, and spoke in a plain, respectable voice. She had a kind, half-tired smile. She spoke as if the loss of the glove weighed upon her. She spoke of the records she had at home. Pauline was a helpful girl. She had a soft heart. She loved music. She thought of the small favour, and of the records afterwards, and of how she would still have time for a little of the dance. She agreed. She opened the door of the van and climbed inside. The young woman drove east through the streets of Gorton. She did not speak much. She kept her eyes upon the road. She held the steering wheel with pale, careful hands. The van climbed slowly out of the city, up the long slopes of Hyde and Mottram. The houses grew fewer. The trees grew thicker. The last of the sun burned red upon the tops of the low hills. Pauline watched from the passenger seat. She had never been out this way before. The dusk was warm. The wind came soft through the open window. She held her small handbag upon her lap. Behind them, at a careful distance, another vehicle followed. It was the small green Triumph Tiger Cub motorcycle. Ian Brady rode it in a long dark coat, with a scarf pulled about his face. He kept the lights of the van in his sight. He did not overtake. He did not fall behind. He rode as a man rides who knows exactly where he is going. In the boot of the van, beneath a folded blanket, lay a spade. In a small case slung upon Brady's back lay a camera. In his coat pocket lay a knife. The van climbed higher. The road narrowed. The stone walls closed in upon either side. The last houses fell away. Ahead lay the wide, dark shoulder of Saddleworth Moor. The heather stretched away in low, rolling waves. The peat lay black beneath the grass. A curlew cried far off in the failing light. The sky above was a deep, soft blue. The first stars were beginning to show. The young woman pulled the van onto a small lay-by beside the road. She stopped the engine. She turned to Pauline with a small, tight smile. She said the glove had been lost somewhere down beyond the road, near a low stone wall. She said they would only need to look for a few minutes. She opened her door and stepped out onto the verge. Pauline followed her. Her pink shoes sank a little into the soft, wet ground. She held her handbag close. The wind moved cool upon her bare arms. She looked about her at the wide, empty country and felt, for the first time, a small, cold thought move through her. The young woman led her down a narrow path through the heather. The ground grew soft. The peat gave beneath their feet. The last light of the sky was fading fast. Behind them, along the road, the sound of the motorcycle drew near. It slowed. It stopped. A man's boots crunched upon the gravel of the lay-by. Pauline turned her head. She saw a tall, thin man in a long, dark coat coming down the path toward them. She did not know his name. She did not know his face. She had only a moment to feel afraid. What happened upon that dark stretch of moor in the last of the summer dusk has never been fully told in a way that does honour to the child. The night closed in. The curlew fell silent. The wind moved on across the heather. The stars came out one by one above the low hills. When at last the pair walked back to the van upon the road, only 2 figures moved beneath the pale moon. Only 2 figures drove away. Only 2 figures returned to the streets of Manchester in the small hours of the morning, and only 2 knew where the small pink shoes had come to rest. On Weil Street, Joan Reed sat by the window and waited. She had put the kettle on when the clock struck 10. She had put it on again at 11. She had put it on once more when midnight passed. The tea grew cold in the pot upon the shelf. Amos came home from the bakery in the small hours of the morning with the smell of flour still upon him. He asked, quiet, if Pauline had come back. Joan shook her head. She stood at the front door in her dressing gown and looked up and down the empty street. The gas lamp burned pale upon the corner. A stray cat crossed the pavement and slipped into an alley. There was no sound of a small pair of shoes. By the first grey light of Saturday, the family began to search. Amos put on his coat and walked the length of Wiles Street. He knocked upon doors. He asked at the corner shop. He walked to the British Railways Club and found the door still locked. He walked to the small houses of Pauline's friends. He asked, again and again, in a voice that grew tighter with each door. No one had seen her. No one had spoken to her at the dance. The friend who had dropped out sat at her kitchen table and wept. She had never known Pauline to arrive. The constabulary was told at last on the Saturday afternoon. A young constable came to the house on Wiles Street and stood in the small parlour with his notebook in his hand. He wrote down the plain facts. He wrote down the colour of the dress. He wrote down the height of the girl. He wrote down the pink shoes and the small handbag and the eau de cologne. He asked, in a careful voice, if Pauline had a young man. Joan Reed said no. Pauline was not that kind of girl. Pauline was a good girl. Pauline had gone to a dance and had not come home. The constable was kind. He said the young often stayed out longer than their mothers thought. He said girls sometimes lost their heads at a dance and stopped a little too long at a friend's house. He said he was sure the child would be home by Sunday. He closed his notebook. He tipped his cap. He walked out into the warm July street with the small, patient face of a man who had said such words many times before. Sunday came. Pauline did not come home. Monday came. She did not come home. The days grew into a week, and the week into a month. Amos Reed walked the streets of Gorton until he could walk no more. He went to the police station on Bank Street. He went to the offices of the newspapers. He asked them to print her picture in the paper. They printed it small at the bottom of a column. A pretty girl of 16, missing from a Gorton dance. If seen, contact the constabulary. Joan Reed did not sleep. She kept Pauline's bedroom exactly as it had been left. The bed remained made. The comb lay upon the dressing table. The scent of the eau de cologne faded slowly from the room. She sat at the small kitchen table at all hours and stared at the front door. She kept the porch light burning through the night. She listened for the small click of a buckle upon the pavement. The constabulary made its inquiries. It spoke to the neighbours. It spoke to the girls at the confectionery firm. It spoke to the men at the British Railways Club. No one had seen a small van upon Froxmoor Street. No one had seen a dark motorcycle riding east. The neighbours who had waved to her from their front steps could not say which way she had gone at the end of the road. She had walked out at 7 o'clock in her pink party dress, and the summer dusk had swallowed her. Some in Gorton whispered that she had run away. Some whispered that she had a young man, a secret one, whom her mother had never known. Some whispered that she had drowned in a canal, or fallen ill in the country, or been taken by a stranger to Ireland. The whispers moved along the flagstones and were heard, one after another, by Joan Reed, and each one cut her a little further. She listened. She said nothing. She kept the light burning at the front door. At Millwards, in the second week of July, Myra Hindley came in on the Monday morning as she always did. She hung her coat upon its peg. She sat at her small desk near the window. She fed a sheet of paper into the black underwood typewriter. She typed her invoices in a steady, careful rhythm. At the far end of the office, Ian Brady sat at his ledger. He entered his numbers in a neat, tight hand. Neither of them spoke of a small hired van or of a pale pink dress. Neither of them spoke of the wide, dark shoulder of Saddleworth Moor. At the tea break, the other typists talked of the missing girl. They had read the small piece in the Manchester Evening News. They said it was a shame. They said the mother must be beside herself. They said one could not be too careful with young girls these days. Myra sipped her tea. She said, in a plain, quiet voice, that it was a sad business. She said the poor mother must be worried sick. She stirred her cup slowly with her small teaspoon and looked toward the window. Upstairs at Wardlebrook Avenue, upon the low new shelf, the dark books still waited in their neat row. Beneath the bed, in a small plain case, lay a spade with soft peat still dried upon its edge. In a drawer of the dressing table, wrapped in a scrap of cloth, lay a small piece of a girl's jewellery, kept as a private, watchful token. Downstairs, the old grandmother sat by the fire with her knitting. She spoke, in the evening, of the poor lost girl in the paper. She said her prayers, quiet, for the mother, and for the child, and for a summer that seemed to have grown a shade colder overnight. The days shortened. The evenings came earlier. The washing lines came in as the September rain began. The trams filled with damp coats again. The chimneys smoked once more into a lower sky. The paper stopped printing the small notice at the bottom of the column. The neighbours stopped speaking Pauline's name at the corner shop. On Wild Street, Joan Reed sat by the window and waited. She would sit by that window, in one house and another, for the rest of her long life. The autumn drew in slow and grey across the north. The leaves turned in Bellevue Park. The chestnuts fell in the small back gardens. The frost came at last to the hills above the city. The peat upon the moor grew hard beneath the cold. The heather stiffened. The wind moved sharper across the low, empty country. And in the small stalls of Ashton-under-Lyne Market, on a wet Saturday afternoon in the month of November, another child was already walking, in a warm coat and a pair of leather shoes, toward the long shadow of Saddleworth, the winter of John Kilbride. The winter of 1963 came early to the streets of Ashton-under-Lyne. The rain that had begun in October did not truly stop. It fell soft upon the slate roofs. It ran in slow, brown lines down the gutters. The chimneys of the mills smoked lower in the wet air. The trams rattled through pools of standing water at the corners. In the small houses of the town, the coal fires burned from dawn to bedtime. The wireless sets played the news of the day, of a young queen upon her throne, of ships in a far ocean, of a president shot dead in an American city. To the east of Manchester, at the foot of the Pennine Hills, Ashton-under-Lyne sat as it had sat for many years. It was a town of red brick and low stone. Its streets were narrow. Its chapels were dark with the soot of the mills. Its market square lay near the parish church, at the crossing of the old roads. On a Saturday, the square filled with stalls. Trestle tables were set out in long, wet rows. Tarpaulins were pulled across the tops on ropes. Beneath them stood barrows of apples and turnips, of pigs' trotters and black puddings, of cheap crockery and second-hand coats. On Smallshaw Lane, in a small terraced house upon a hill above the town, lived a family called Kilbride. The father, Patrick, was an Irish labourer. He had come across the sea for the work after the war. He was a tall, quiet man with red hair beginning to grey at the temples. The mother, Sheila, kept the house. She scrubbed the front step each morning and fed a large brood of children at the small kitchen table. There were 7 of them in all. John was the eldest. He was 12 years old. John Kilbride was a slight, dark-haired boy with a soft, freckled face. He wore short trousers and long grey socks and a dark blue jersey his mother had knitted. He had a warm woolen coat with a hood, bought new at the co-op for the coming winter. He had a pair of leather shoes with laces tied in careful bows. He was quiet at home and gentle with the smaller ones. He liked to help his mother with the washing. He liked to carry his little brother upon his back through the yard. He liked to go, on a Saturday afternoon, down into the market to earn a few coppers helping the stall-holders pack their crates. On the 23rd of November, a wet Saturday, John went to the pictures with his friend John Ryan. It was the day after the news had come from Dallas of the American president. The town felt hushed, the way a town feels when great sorrow has passed through the wireless overnight. The rain fell steady. The pavements shone dark. The boys walked down Smallshaw Lane in their damp coats, hands deep in their pockets, breath white upon the cold air. They paid their small coins at the Pavilion Cinema and sat in the warm dark to watch a film of cowboys. When the film was over, they came out into a grey, wet afternoon. The market was still open. The stallholders were beginning to pack away. John Kilbride said he would go down and help. He often did on a Saturday. He knew the men by their nicknames. He knew which barrow needed a hand with its tarpaulin. He knew who might give him sixpence for an hour's work, or a half-eaten pie, or a bag of bruised apples to take home to his mother. His friend John Ryan said he would go home. He was hungry. He had a comic he wished to read by the fire. The two boys parted at the edge of the square, and John Kilbride turned into the market alone. The stalls stood in long, wet rows beneath the dripping tarpaulins. The gas lamps of the town were already coming on, pale in the failing light. The smell of frying onions came from a hot pie stall at the corner. The smell of paraffin came from the lamps beneath the trestles. The smell of wet cloth came from the coats of the men and women who moved slow between the stands. John moved among them in his warm woolen coat. He carried a wooden crate for a stall holder. He was given a paper bag of biscuits for his trouble. He stood, near the closing of the market, upon the wet stones near a stall selling second-hand toys and old carpets. A young woman stood not far from him. She wore a headscarf tied under her chin and a wool coat buttoned to the throat. Her hair, pale beneath the scarf, was cut short at the shoulders. She had a plain, careful face. She looked, to a passing eye, like any other young woman come down to buy a length of cloth or a set of chipped plates before the stalls closed. She spoke, in a soft, friendly voice, to the boy. She said she was sorry to trouble him. She said she had lost a glove somewhere along the way. She said she had bought a great pile of things and could not carry them all. She said her husband was waiting in the car nearby. She said if he would help her carry a box or two across to the car, she would be much obliged, and she would give him a bottle of sherry to take home to his mother for the Christmas. She said it with the small, tired half-smile of a woman glad of a helping pair of hands. John Kilbride was a helpful boy. He had been raised to open a door for a lady, and to carry a basket for an old woman. His mother had taught him that. His father had taught him that. It was the plain way of the streets in which he had grown up. He looked at the young woman in her tidy coat. He looked at her kind, quiet face. He said he would help. She gave him a small nod. She led him out from the wet square toward a car parked upon a side street. The car was a small Ford Anglia, hired that day from a garage in the city. At the wheel sat a thin young man in a dark coat, with a scarf pulled about his neck. He did not turn his head as the boy came near. The young woman opened the passenger door. She said the box was in the back. She said John should climb in for a moment and hand it out to her. She spoke as one speaks to a small brother. John climbed in without fear. He was 12 years old. He had a paper bag of biscuits in his pocket. He had a Christmas bottle of sherry to take home to his mother. The car pulled slowly away from the wet curb. It moved through the narrow streets of Ashton. It passed the parish church. It passed the last of the closing stalls. It climbed the long slope out of the town. The rain grew heavier upon the windscreen. The wipers moved back and forth in a slow, steady beat. Behind the car, at a careful distance, rode a small green motorcycle. It rode as it had ridden once before, on a warm July evening, through the streets of Gorton. It kept the tail lamps of the car in its sight. It did not overtake. It did not fall behind. The road climbed east into the low hills. The houses fell away. The stone walls closed in upon either side. The last farm chimneys smoked pale into the sky. Ahead, the wide, dark shoulder of Saddleworth Moor rose beneath the low cloud. The heather lay black in the wet dusk. The peat lay soft beneath the grass. No lamp shone anywhere upon that country. No small window burned in any farm. There was only the road and the wind and the long, slow sigh of the winter grass. The car turned into a small lay-by beside the road. The engine fell silent. The rain hushed upon the roof. The young woman stepped out onto the verge. She held a small torch in her gloved hand. She said the box had shifted. She said John should come out and help her lift it. He climbed out into the wet dark. His leather shoes sank a little in the soft ground. He held his coat close against the wind. He looked about him at the wide, empty country and felt, perhaps, The first small, cold thought that a boy can feel when he understands he is very far from home. Behind them, the sound of the motorcycle drew near. It slowed. It stopped upon the gravel. A man's boots crunched down upon the verge. What passed upon that dark stretch of moor in the last of a November afternoon has never been told in a way that can honour a 12-year-old boy. The wind moved on across the heather. The rain fell steady. The curlew that had cried once in the July dusk had long since flown south. There was only the peat and the black hills and the long, patient silence of a country that keeps what is given to it. When at last the car pulled back onto the road, its tail lamps small in the wet dark, only 2 figures rode inside. The motorcycle followed. The pair drove back down the long slope toward the lights of Manchester. They reached the small house upon Wardlebrook Avenue in the late hours of the night. The old grandmother was long since asleep in her chair. The fire had burned low in the grate. The wireless had been switched off. Upstairs, upon the low shelf, the dark books waited in their neat row. Beside them, upon the dressing table, lay a small camera, loaded with a fresh reel of black and white film. On Smallshaw Lane, Sheila Kilbride stood at the front door and looked up the wet street. The kettle sang upon the hob behind her. The younger children played on the parlour rug. John should have been home for his tea. It was long past the hour. She wiped her hands upon her apron. She called out to Patrick that the lad was late. Patrick pulled on his coat. He walked down the hill in the rain toward the market. He asked at the closing stalls. He asked at the door of the Pavilion Cinema. He walked back up the hill in the dark with the water running from the brim of his cap. By the small hours of the morning, the Kilbride family knew that something was very wrong. Patrick walked to the constabulary station in the town. He stood at the wooden counter in his wet coat and told a young constable that his boy had not come home from the pictures. The constable wrote it down in his book. He spoke, in the plain, patient voice such men use, of boys who often stay out at a friend's house. He said John would be home for his breakfast. He said not to worry. Patrick walked home through the rain and told his wife what the constable had said. She did not sleep that night. She sat by the front window with her knitting in her lap and did not knit. Sunday came. John did not come home. Monday came. He did not come home. The children were sent off to school with pale, frightened faces. Sheila stood at the front door in her apron and watched them walk down the hill. She kept the porch light burning through every night. She kept the kettle upon the hob at all hours. She would sit at that window, in that small house, for many long years to come. The constabulary of Ashton-under-Lyne began its long, patient search. It sent men out into the streets in their heavy, dark uniforms and their high, polished boots. They knocked upon doors. They spoke to the stall-holders in the market square. They spoke to the ticket girl at the Pavilion Cinema. They spoke to John Ryan, who wept quietly in his mother's parlour, and said only that they had parted at the edge of the market. They spoke to the men who had given John the paper bag of biscuits. No one had seen a small Ford Anglia. No one had seen a young woman in a headscarf. No one had seen a dark motorcycle in the wet November dusk. In the days that followed, more constables were called in. They walked the streets of Ashton in long, slow lines. They knocked upon every door in the town. They searched the small yards behind the houses. They searched the coal sheds and the outdoor privies. They walked the banks of the canal with long poles in their hands. They dragged the darker stretches of the water. They found only a lost dog and a rusted bicycle wheel and an old iron kettle. They did not find a small boy in a warm woolen coat. The Manchester newspapers printed his picture upon their front pages. A small, freckled face beneath a schoolboy fringe. A soft, careful smile. 12 years old. Missing from Ashton Market. Last seen in a dark blue jersey and a warm coat. The picture ran for many days. Neighbours cut it out and pinned it to their kitchen walls. Wives spoke of it in the queues at the butcher and the baker. Men spoke of it at the corner of the public house. The whole town seemed to hold its breath. At Millwards, on the Monday morning after John Kilbride had vanished, Myra Hindley came into work as she always did. She hung her wool coat upon its peg. She sat at her small desk near the window. She fed a sheet of paper into the black underwood typewriter She typed her invoices in a steady, careful rhythm. At the far end of the office, Ian Brady sat at his ledger. He entered his numbers in a neat, tight hand. Neither of them spoke of a small hired car or of a wet market square. Neither of them spoke of the wide, dark shoulder of Saddleworth Moor. At the tea break, the other typist spoke of the missing boy. They had read the small piece in the Manchester Evening News. They said it was a terrible thing. They said the mother must be beside herself. They said one could not let the little ones out of one's sight these days. Myra sipped her cup of tea. She said, in a plain, quiet voice, that it was a sad business. She said the poor mother must be worried sick. She stirred her cup slowly with her small teaspoon and looked toward the window at the wet grey sky. The days shortened. The Christmas lamps went up in the shops. The chapels rang their bells for Advent. The trams filled with damp coats and folded umbrellas. On Smallshaw Lane, Sheila Kilbride hung a small paper chain across the parlour, out of habit more than hope. Patrick sat by the fire with a cup of tea he did not drink. The younger children spoke less of their brother as the weeks passed, though they still looked, each of them, at the empty chair at the kitchen table. The porch light burned every night. The kettle sang upon the hob at all hours. No small pair of leather shoes crossed the wet flagstones of the yard. At Wardlebrook Avenue the old grandmother spoke, in the evenings, of the poor lost boy in the paper. She said her quiet prayers by the fire. She said the world was not what it had once been. Upstairs, upon the low shelf, the dark books waited in their neat row. In the drawer of the dressing table, wrapped in a scrap of paper, lay a small square of a boy's photograph that no one in Ashton would ever see. Downstairs the wireless played a soft carol from a chapel in London. The rain fell against the window, and somewhere in the wet, cold hills above the town, the peat had closed its slow, dark hand over a second small grave, and the winter had only just begun. Beyond the frost of that hard January, another spring would come. Another summer would come after it. The heather would bloom again upon the moor. The trams would still rattle down Hyde Road. The chapel bells would still ring across the yards of Gorton and Ashton and Hattersley. And upon a warm June night in 1964, in a small street in the district of Longsight, another 12-year-old boy would step out of his mother's front door in a fresh white shirt, and he would cross the road toward the door of his grandmother, and the dusk would rise once more, slow and quiet, from the low corners of the city. The Vanishing of Keith Bennett. The winter of 1963 passed slowly into the spring of 1964. The frost broke upon the yards of Manchester. The snow melted from the low roofs. The gutters ran clear again with cold brown water. The chapels rang their bells for Easter. The washing lines rose once more across the small back gardens. In the shops of Piccadilly, the paper chains came down. The Christmas lamps were packed away in their tissue paper. The trams filled with lighter coats, and the days grew long. To the southeast of the city, in the district of Longsight, a small terraced street ran between two rows of dark brick houses. It was called Ashton Street. It was much like 100 other streets in Manchester. The doorsteps were scrubbed each morning. The privet hedges gave off a sharp green smell in the dusk. The children played out late upon the pavements. The gas lamps burned pale at the corners. On a warm summer evening, a wireless would play softly through an open window, and the sound of a mother calling her boy home would carry down the row. At number 29 Ashton Street, in the summer of 1964, lived a young mother named Winnie Johnson. She was a small, dark-haired woman in her middle 20s. She had been married very young. She had 4 children in the house, and 1 more on the way. She kept the house neat. She scrubbed the front step each morning. She cooked plain meals of stew and bread and tea at a small black stove. She hung the washing across a line strung between 2 poles in the little backyard. She worked, when she could, at cleaning small offices in the city for a few extra shillings a week. Her eldest boy was called Keith Bennett. He was 12 years old that June. He was slight and small for his age. He had a bright, quick face and a soft brown fringe of hair. He wore short grey trousers and long grey socks. He wore a pale blue shirt with a small collar. He wore a pair of round steel spectacles, for he was short-sighted, and his mother told him always to keep them safe upon his nose. He was fond of his little brothers and sister. He was fond of his mother. He was very fond of his grandmother, Gertrude Bennett, who lived in a small house on Morton Street, only a short walk away. On the 16th of June, a Tuesday evening, Winnie was preparing for her weekly outing. She played the bingo at a small hall in Longsight. It was her one small pleasure of the week. It cost her a shilling, and gave her an hour or two out of the small parlour. Her mother, Gertrude, kept the little ones for her on the bingo nights. Keith often went along to his grandmother's house. He liked the peace of her front room. He liked the plate of biscuits she kept in a tin upon the sideboard. He liked to lie upon her hearthrug and read the small comics she saved for him from her own boy's childhood. The evening was warm and soft. The sun still hung above the rooftops when Winnie stepped out of the front door with her small purse in her hand. Keith walked at her side. He wore his pale blue shirt, freshly pressed. He wore his short trousers and his long grey socks. He wore his round spectacles pushed a little up his nose. His hair had been combed neat by his mother's hand a moment before at the kitchen sink. She had given him a kiss upon the crown of his head. He carried, in his small pocket, a few pennies for a paper of chips on the way home. They walked together to the corner of the road. They came to the crossing of a wider street called Stockport Road. The traffic was heavier there. The buses came slow, in a long, patient line. The lamps at the corner were only just beginning to hum into their pale evening glow. Winnie stopped at the curb. She looked down at her boy. She said this was as far as she could go with him. She said he must cross the road carefully. She said he must go straight to his grandmother's house and stay there until she came for him. She said, as mothers say, that he must not speak to any stranger. Keith looked up at her through his small spectacles. He gave her a small, patient smile. He was 12 years old. He had crossed this road 100 times before. His grandmother's house was only a few streets away. The evening was warm and quiet. He said he would be careful. He said he would go straight to his grandmother. He waited beside her for a break in the traffic. When it came, he stepped out onto the wide grey road. He walked in his small, careful way, with his spectacles pushed high upon his nose. He reached the far pavement. He turned once, and he waved a small, brief wave to his mother. She waved back. He turned again, and he walked on. Winnie stood a moment at the curb. She watched the small pale blue shirt move away between the passing figures of the street. She watched the round of his brown head and the neat combed line of his hair. She watched him until the crowd upon the far pavement closed about him, and she could see him no more. She waited a moment longer. She said a small, quiet word to herself. Then she turned and walked on, in the other direction, toward the small hall where the bingo cards were already being laid out upon the trestle tables. Keith Bennett walked on toward Morton Street. He passed the closing corner shops. He passed the doors of the small terraced houses much like his own. The dusk was slow to fall. The sky above the rooftops was a deep, soft blue. A boy on a bicycle rattled past him upon the flagstones. A cat sat washing itself upon a low garden wall. From somewhere, a wireless played the sound of a dance band from a chapel hall. He walked, as any 12-year-old boy walks upon a warm summer evening, with his hands deep in his pockets and a few pennies chinking softly against his leg. He came to a quiet stretch of road. The houses on one side gave way to a plain brick wall. The pavement narrowed. The lamps were fewer. A small hired van was pulled into the curb ahead. It was a plain Ford Anglia van, hired that day from a garage in the city. At the wheel sat a young woman with pale, back-combed hair beneath a light headscarf. She wore a wool jacket buttoned to the throat. She leaned across, and she rolled down the passenger window, and she called out to him in a soft, friendly voice. She was sorry to trouble him. She had lost a glove somewhere upon the low-waste ground beyond the road. It was a favourite glove, and she was on her way home, and she thought she might find it if she had another pair of eyes to look. She said it would take only a moment, and she would give him a few shillings for his trouble, and drop him at his grandmother's door afterwards. She spoke as one grown woman speaks to a helpful boy. She had a tidy, careful face. Her voice was plain and Manchester and warm. Keith Bennett hesitated. His mother's word rang small and clear in his ear. He must go straight to his grandmother's. He must not speak to strangers. He looked at the young woman. She was not a man. She had a neat coat and a headscarf and a soft, half-tired smile. She had spoken of a lost glove and a few shillings and a lift to the door. He thought, perhaps, of the paper of chips he might buy his little brother on the way home. He thought, perhaps, of how it would only be a moment. He was 12 years old. He was small. He was kind. He walked to the side of the van, and he opened the passenger door, and he climbed inside. The young woman drove east through the streets of Longsight and Levenshulme. She did not speak much. She held the steering wheel with pale, careful hands. She kept her eyes upon the road. The buses gave way as she passed. The lamps of the city glowed on above the tram wires. Keith sat in the passenger seat with his spectacles pushed high upon his nose. He watched the streets grow slowly stranger about him. He watched the houses give way to smaller houses, and the smaller houses give way to open fields, and the open fields give way to the long, slow climb of a country road. Behind them, at a careful distance, rode a small green motorcycle. Ian Brady rode it in a dark coat, with a scarf pulled about his face. He kept the tail lamps of the van in his sight. He did not overtake. He did not fall behind. He rode as he had ridden once before, on a July evening past, and once again on a wet November afternoon. In the boot of the van, beneath a folded blanket, lay a spade. In a small case slung upon his back lay a cheap camera loaded with a fresh reel of film. In his coat pocket, cool against his hand, lay the shape of a knife. The road climbed east out of the city. It passed the last of the mill chimneys. It passed the last of the street lamps. It climbed the long slope through Mottram and out beyond Hollingworth. The houses grew fewer. The trees grew thicker. The last of the sun burned pale upon the tops of the low hills. Ahead, beneath a soft evening sky, rose the wide, dark shoulder of Saddleworth Moor. The heather stretched away in slow, rolling waves. The peat lay soft beneath the grass. A curlew cried, far off, and fell still. The van turned, at a small, unmarked place, onto a narrow lay-by beside the road. The engine fell silent. The wind moved low across the heather. The young woman stepped out onto the verge. Her shoes sank a little into the soft peat. She held a small torch in her gloved hand. She said the glove was down beyond a low stone wall. She said it would take only a moment. She spoke as a grown woman speaks to a helpful boy. Keith Bennett climbed out into the wide, quiet dusk. He held his small round spectacles against the wind. He looked about him at the wide, empty country. He felt, perhaps, the first small cold thought that a boy can feel when he understands he is very far from any door he knows. Behind them, along the road, the sound of the motorcycle drew near. It slowed. It stopped. A man's boots crunched down upon the gravel of the lay-by. What passed upon that dark stretch of moor, in the last of a June evening, has never been fully told in a way that can honour a 12-year-old boy in a pale blue shirt and small round spectacles. The wind moved on across the heather. The peat lay soft and dark. The curlew that had cried once at dusk did not cry again. The stars came out, slow and clear, above the long dark line of the hills. When at last the small hired van drew away from the lay-by, only 2 figures rode inside. The motorcycle followed. And of Keith Bennett, of his small, careful walk, and his soft brown fringe, and his round steel spectacles, there was no more sign upon that country, and there would never be. On Eston Street in Longsight, Winnie Johnson came home from the bingo hall in the small hours of the night. Her purse was a few pennies lighter, and her spirits a little lifted. She stopped, as she had said she would, at her mother's house upon Morton Street. She knocked at the door. Gertrude Bennett opened it in her nightgown, with a shawl pulled about her shoulders. She looked confused. She said Keith had never come. She said she had waited the whole evening. She had thought Winnie must have kept him at home. The two women stood upon the doorstep in the dark. The lamps burned pale upon the corners. A small breeze moved along the flagstones. Winnie put her hand to her mouth. She could not at first quite understand. She said she had watched him cross the road herself. She said she had waved to him from the far curb. She said he had waved back to her, and turned, and walked on. Gertrude gathered her shawl tighter. She said perhaps he had gone to a friend's. She said perhaps he had stopped for a paper of chips. She said not to worry. They walked together, at once, through the small streets. They knocked upon the doors of the friends they knew. They asked at the corner shop. They walked to the chippy at the top of the road. The chippy was closed. The friends had not seen him. The neighbours shook their heads with slow, kind faces. Winnie's voice grew tighter with each door. Her hand shook a little as she raised it to the next brass knocker. By the small hours of the morning, she stood at the counter of the local constabulary in her thin summer coat, and she said, in a voice she barely knew, that her boy had gone to his grandmother's house and had never arrived. A young constable wrote it down in his book. He was patient and kind. He said the young often stopped along the way. He said boys of 12 had a habit of straying off to find a friend, or a comic, or a paper of sweets. He said Keith would be home for his breakfast. Winnie shook her head. She said her boy did not stray. Her boy was a good boy. Her boy had waved to her from the far pavement of Stockport Road, and she had watched him go. The constable closed his book. He tipped his cap. He said he would send a man round in the morning. The morning came. Keith did not come home. The little ones sat at the kitchen table in their pyjamas and looked with wide eyes at the empty chair. Winnie combed her hair with a hand that shook. She went out again, alone, and walked the streets of Longsight in the early sun. She knocked upon every door she could think of. She walked to Stockport Road. She stood at the very curb where she had watched her boy cross. She looked at the far pavement, at the plain shop fronts, and the closing gates of a small yard, and she could not make herself believe that he had walked away from that spot and simply vanished. The days went on. The paper printed a small notice. The constabulary made its inquiries. Men in dark uniforms walked slow up and down Stockport Road. They asked at every shop. They asked at every bus stop. They spoke to conductors and drivers. They spoke to a paper boy who had seen a boy in a pale blue shirt walking east upon the pavement, and then had lost him among the passing figures. No one had seen a small hired van. No one had seen a young woman in a headscarf. No one had seen a dark motorcycle upon the long climb east. Winnie Johnson did not sleep. She sat by the front window of the house on Eston Street with a small cup of tea gone cold beside her. She stared out at the empty street. She watched the milk cart come and go. She watched the neighbours pass on their way to the mills. She kept the porch light burning every night. She kept a plate for Keith upon the kitchen shelf. She would keep that light burning and that plate ready for the rest of her long, patient life. At Millwards, on the Wednesday morning after Keith Bennett had vanished, Myra Hindley came into work as she always did. She hung her light summer jacket upon its peg. She sat at her small desk near the window. She fed a sheet of paper into the black Underwood typewriter. She typed her invoices in a steady, careful rhythm. At the far end of the office, Ian Brady sat at his ledger. He entered his numbers in his neat, tight hand. At the tea break, the other typists spoke of the small notice in the paper. They said it was a shame. They said one could not let the little ones out of one's sight. Myra sipped her tea. She said, in a plain, quiet voice, that it was a sad business. She stirred her cup slowly with her small teaspoon and looked toward the window. The summer moved on. The washing lines still hung across the yards. The chapels still rang their bells on Sundays. The trams still rattled down Hyde Road. In the small house on Wardlebrook Avenue, the old grandmother spoke, in the evenings, of the poor lost boy in Longsight. She said her quiet prayers by the fire. She said the world was not what it had once been. Upstairs, upon the low shelf, the dark books waited in their neat row. In a drawer of the dressing table, wrapped in a scrap of paper, lay a small square of a boy's photograph that no one in Longsight would ever see. The days grew shorter again. The autumn leaves turned in Bellevue Park. The chestnuts fell in the small back gardens. The frost came at last to the hills above the city, and the peat upon the moor grew hard beneath the cold. And in the shops of Manchester, as the winter came round once more, the small paper chains were unfolded from their tissue, and the wireless sets began, in the evenings, to play the first slow carols, and in the district of Ancoats, a little girl of 10 was already looking forward to a small funfair upon a piece of waste ground at the end of a Boxing Day afternoon. The Christmas of Lesley Ann Downey. The Christmas of 1964 came slow and cold to Manchester. The frost lay thick upon the yards. The rain that had fallen for weeks turned at last to a soft, patient snow. It settled on the low roofs of Ancoats and Miles Platting. It settled on the black railings of the parish churches. It settled on the flat caps of the men who came out at dawn to shovel the pavements clear. The chimneys of the mills smoked pale into a low grey sky. The wireless sets played the carols of the season, of shepherds in the fields, of a small child in a manger, of peace on earth and goodwill to all people. In the shops of Piccadilly, the paper chains had been strung along the ceilings for weeks. The windows glowed with small coloured lamps. The counters held tins of sweets and boxes of crackers, and cheap glass baubles wrapped in tissue. The queues at the butcher stretched out into the wet street. Wives stood with their ration coats buttoned to the throat, their string bags empty against their sides. The children pressed their small faces to the glass of the toy shops on Deansgate. They stared at the trains and the dolls and the tin soldiers set out in careful rows. In the district of Ancoats, to the northeast of the city centre, the streets were narrow and old. The mills stood close upon the pavements. The chapels were dark with the soot of 100 years. The Rochdale Canal ran cold and slow between the tall brick walls. On a small terraced street called Charnley Walk, in a house much like every other on the row, lived a family called West. The mother was a young woman named Anne. She had been married twice. Her first husband, Terence Downey, had gone from the marriage some years before. Her second husband, Alan West, was a labourer, quiet and kind. Anne had 4 children in the house. The eldest was a little girl of 10. Her name was Lesley Ann Downey. She was small for her age, with a soft, round face and dark brown hair cut short at the shoulders. She had a bright, quick smile. She had large brown eyes. She wore a pale blue dress with a small white collar, kept for her best. She wore a pair of leather shoes with laces her mother tied each morning at the kitchen chair. She was fond of her little brothers. She was fond of her mother. She liked to sing along to the songs on the wireless. She liked to draw small pictures on the backs of old envelopes with a stub of pencil kept in a drawer. The Christmas Day of 1964 had passed in the small house on Charnley Walk in the plain, glad way of that street. There had been a small chicken upon the table, bought with the savings of many weeks. There had been a paper crown pulled from a cheap cracker. There had been a small pile of gifts wrapped in tissue at the foot of Lesley's bed. She had been given a set of ribbons for her hair. She had been given a small doll with a painted face. She had been given a bag of sherbet lemons and a paper of chocolate money in gold foil. She had gone to bed that night with the doll pressed close beneath her chin, and she had slept the deep, warm sleep of a child who has been happy all day. Boxing Day dawned grey and cold. The snow of the days before had turned to a hard crust upon the pavements. The sky above the rooftops was low and pale. The bells of the parish church rang out for the morning service. The chimneys smoked slow into the still air. In the small yards of Ancoats, the washing had been left in for the holiday, and the lines hung empty and dark against the walls. That afternoon, a small travelling funfair was set up upon a piece of waste ground on Hume Hall Lane, only a short walk from Charnley Walk. It had come, as such fairs came, with its painted vans and its striped canvas and its coloured bulbs strung on cables between the poles. It had a small roundabout with wooden horses. It had a set of swing boats worked by hand. It had a coconut shy and a hoopla stall, and a small kiosk selling toffee apples and sticks of pink candy floss. The stall keepers wore heavy coats and fingerless gloves. Their breath steamed white in the cold. Their voices carried through the dusk as they called to the children of the streets. Lesley Ann had been promised the fair by her mother. She had spoken of it all through Christmas Day. She had counted her small pile of shillings into her hand. She had 6 shillings and 8 pence in all, saved from small errands and given at Christmas by her aunts. She held the coins tight in her handkerchief when she set out with 2 of her brothers and a small cousin, in the middle of the afternoon. She wore a red tartan skirt and a pale blue coat with brass buttons. She wore white socks and her best leather shoes. Her mother had combed her dark hair back into a small bow. Her mother had told her to stay close to her brothers and to come home before dark. The 4 small children walked hand in hand along Charnley Walk. They turned onto the wider road. They passed the closing corner shops. They passed the doors of the small terraced houses much like their own. The dusk was already beginning to fall, though the hour was still early. The lamps at the corners were coming on, pale in the grey air. The coloured bulbs of the fair glowed ahead of them upon the waste ground, small and warm against the winter sky. They reached the fair, and they parted at once, in the way of children given a shilling and told to spend it as they pleased. The brothers went to the coconut shy. The cousin went to the swing boats. Lesley Ann walked slowly among the stalls. She stood at the hoopla and watched the wooden rings sail through the air. She stood at the little roundabout and watched the wooden horses move up and down upon their brass poles. She bought a small stick of candy floss and held it high in her mittened hand. She rode the roundabout twice. She rode the swing boats once. She stood at the edge of the fair with the coloured lamps reflected in her large brown eyes, and she seemed, to any who might have watched her, a small, glad child upon a Boxing Day afternoon. Somewhere among the stalls, in the thin winter dusk, a young woman moved slow through the crowd. She wore a headscarf tied under her chin. She wore a wool coat buttoned to the throat. Her hair, pale beneath the scarf, was cut short at the shoulders. She had a plain, careful face. She looked, to a passing eye, like any young wife come down to the fair with a small errand of her own. She stood a little way off, and she watched the small child in the red tartan skirt and the pale blue coat. She watched the child ride the roundabout. She watched the child buy her candy floss. She watched the child stand alone at the edge of the crowd when her brothers had wandered on among the other stalls. Not far off, a thin young man in a dark coat stood beside a plain hired car parked upon the edge of the waste ground. He had a scarf pulled about his neck. He did not go among the stalls. He did not buy a toffee apple or a stick of candy floss. He waited beside the car with his hands in his pockets, and he watched the young woman move slow among the coloured lamps of the fair. The young woman came at last to the small child at the edge of the crowd. She stopped near her, and she gave a small, half-tired smile. She spoke in a soft, friendly voice. She was sorry to trouble her. She had bought a great pile of things at the market that morning, and could not carry them all to her car. She had asked at a few of the stalls, but the men were busy with their own work. She wondered if the little girl might help her carry a box or 2 across the waste ground. She said she would give her some shillings for her trouble, and she would drop her back at her own front door afterwards. Lesley Ann was a helpful child. She had been raised in the plain way of Ancoats to open a door for a lady and to carry a basket for an old woman. She looked up at the young woman in the headscarf. She looked at the tidy coat and the plain, careful face. She thought perhaps of the shillings, and of how she might buy her mother a small gift with them, and of how it would only be a moment. She had her brothers somewhere at the fair. She had her mother in the small house only a few streets away. She was 10 years old. She said she would help. She walked with the young woman across the waste ground, toward the plain hired car. The coloured lamps of the fair glowed behind her. The wooden horses turned in slow circles upon the roundabout. The tinny music of the small organ played a carol of shepherds and stars. The young woman opened the passenger door. She said the box was in the back. She said Lesley Ann should climb in for a moment. The little girl climbed in without fear. She was 10 years old. She had 6 shillings and 8 pence knotted in a handkerchief in her pocket. She had a small stick of candy floss half eaten in her mittened hand. The car pulled slowly away from the edge of the waste ground. It moved through the narrow streets of Ancoats. It crossed the canal. It climbed the long slope out of the city. Behind it, at a careful distance, rode a small green motorcycle in the cold winter dusk. The car did not turn toward the moor that night. It did not climb the long road east. It drove instead through the low lights of the outer streets, toward the fresh council estate high on a hill above the city, and toward the small house on Wardlebrook Avenue at the end of a plain grey row. What passed within that small house on the evening of Boxing Day 1964 has never been told in a way that can honour a small child of 10 in a pale blue coat and a red tartan skirt. It is enough to say that a cheap reel-to-reel recorder had been set upon the low shelf beside the dark books. It is enough to say that a small camera had been loaded with a fresh reel of film. It is enough to say that, in the years that followed, the plain, small voice of Lesley Downey would be heard in a courtroom at Chester Assizes, and that grave, hard men in wigs and gowns would sit with their heads bowed, and that the mother of the child would cry out in the public gallery, and that a whole nation would come to know, in a single sentence read out over the wireless, that some sorrows are too great to be spoken of in the open air. On Charnley Walk, that Boxing Day evening, Anne West grew uneasy at the front window. The three boys had come home from the fair without their sister. They had thought she had gone home ahead of them. They had thought she was already in the parlour by the fire. Anne pulled her coat about her shoulders. She walked out into the cold dusk. She walked back down the road toward the waste ground. She asked at the stalls. She asked the stall keepers in their heavy coats and fingerless gloves. She asked the boy at the coconut shy. She asked the woman at the hoopla. No one had seen a small child in a red tartan skirt leave the fair. By nightfall, the family stood at the counter of the local constabulary. Alan West spoke in a low, steady voice. Anne sat beside him upon a wooden bench with her hands folded tight upon her lap. A young constable wrote down the plain facts. He wrote down the pale blue coat with the brass buttons. He wrote down the red tartan skirt. He wrote down the white socks and the leather shoes. He wrote down the 6 shillings and 8 pence knotted in a handkerchief. He said, as he had said to other mothers before, that the young often stopped along the way. He said Lesley Ann would surely be home by breakfast. Breakfast came. Lesley Ann did not come home. The days passed into a week. The week passed into a month. The paper printed her picture at the bottom of a column. The neighbours of Ancoats brought small dishes of stew to the door of Charnley Walk. The chapels rang their bells for the new year. On Wardlebrook Avenue, the old grandmother sat by the fire with her knitting and spoke, in the evenings, of the poor lost girl in the paper. She said her quiet prayers by the flames. She said the world was not what it had once been. Upstairs, upon the low shelf, the dark books waited in their neat row. Beside them, in a small tin case, wrapped in a length of brown paper, a reel of magnetic tape lay still and cold, and a small strip of black and white photographs lay hidden in the drawer of the dressing table. The winter drew on. The snow came again, thicker this time. The trams rattled through the slush at the corners. The chimneys smoked low. In the small house at Wardlebrook Avenue, the fire burned in the grate. The wireless played a soft tune from the parlour. Ian Brady and Myra Hindley sat close on the small sofa in the evenings. They did not speak of a Boxing Day fair. They did not speak of a small stick of candy floss. They spoke, quiet, of the books upon the shelf, and of the moor above the city, and of a small ring of others who might, one day, be brought slowly and carefully into a wider circle of what they had done. For it had begun to seem to Brady, in that cold winter, that the small secret of Wardlebrook Avenue might yet be shared with another. He had begun to speak of a young man not far off, a boy of 17 who had married Myra's own sister. He had begun to say that a wider work might be built, if only a second pair of hands could be brought in. He had begun to speak, in his soft, careful voice, of the young husband of Maureen, of the boy called David Smith, who lived with his wife and their new baby in a small flat only a short walk from the house on Wardlebrook Avenue, and who might, in the year to come, be led step by step to the low shelf and the dark books and the wide, empty country above the town. The witness at Hattersley. The autumn of 1965 came slow and wet to the hill above the city. The rain that had begun in September did not truly stop. It fell soft upon the pale bricks of the new estate at Hattersley. It ran in slow brown lines down the fresh concrete gutters. It settled in wide, shallow pools upon the bare mud between the pavements. The lawns that the council had promised were still only a thin skin of grass upon clay. The saplings tied to their stakes bent low in the wind. The rows of small houses stood in long, straight lines against a low grey sky, and the smoke of the city below rose up to meet the smoke of the low cloud, and the two mingled into one soft, damp pall above the hill. David Smith was 17 years old that autumn. He was a slight young man with dark hair combed back from a high forehead. He wore narrow trousers and a leather jacket. He kept a comb in his back pocket and a packet of woodbines in the breast of his shirt. He had married Myra's younger sister, Maureen, in the August of the year before. She was 16 then. She was carrying his child upon the day of the wedding. They had lived at first in a small back room in Gorton. In the summer of 1965, the council had given them a flat upon the same estate at Hattersley, only a short walk from the small house on Wardlebrook Avenue. The young couple had a baby daughter. She was called Angela Dawn. She had come into the world in the spring. She had lived a few short months. In the April of that year, she had died in her small cot, of the quiet sickness that carried away so many of the babies of that time. Maureen had grieved for her in a soft, dark way. She had folded away the little clothes into a drawer. She had kept a small lock of the baby's hair in a paper twist. She sat, in the evenings, at the kitchen table of the small flat, and she stared at the window, and she did not always know that her husband had come in from the yard. David worked, when he could, as a labourer. He had come out of school with little to show for it. He had been in trouble as a boy. He had stood before a magistrate on more than one small charge. He had spent a short spell at an attendance centre. He was known in the streets of Gorton as a lad who might swing a fist, and known upon the estate at Hattersley as a lad who kept himself to himself. He was young. He was married. He had lost a child. He drank when he had the money. He walked, most evenings, in the low winter dusk, along the pavements between his own front door and the front door of the small house on Wardlebrook Avenue. Brady had begun, that summer, to draw the young man closer. He had lent him books from the low shelf. He had lent him a slim volume of Nietzsche in a plain paper cover. He had lent him a book upon the Great War and its dark grey uniforms. He had lent him, once or twice, one of the crude magazines from behind the row of paperback thrillers. He had spoken to him, quiet, at the kitchen table, over a glass of cheap red wine. He had spoken of how the strong took what they wished. He had spoken of how kindness was only a mask that the weak wore. He had spoken of how a man might, one day, do a great work upon a stretch of empty country, and how a witness at his side might share, a little, in the doing. David had listened. He had drunk the wine. He had turned the small, dark pages of the books. He had thought some of it a young man's clever talk over a bottle. He had thought some of it strange and cold. He had thought, sometimes, that Brady spoke as though he meant every word. He had begun to keep, in a small blue notebook, a few of the sentences that Brady had said to him. He had written them out in a careful, boyish hand. He had thought, perhaps, that they made him a serious young man who read serious books. On the evening of the 6th of October, a Wednesday, David Smith sat at the small kitchen table of his flat. It was near 10 o'clock. The rain hushed against the window. Maureen was in the other room with a magazine upon her lap. There came a soft knock at the door. It was Myra. She had come down the short walk from Wardlebrook Avenue. She wore her wool coat buttoned to the throat. She said she had forgotten to bring some miniature bottles of spirits that she had promised her sister. She said David might walk back with her now to fetch them. She said Ian would be pleased to see him. She spoke, as she often spoke, in her plain, careful voice. David pulled on his jacket. He walked out into the wet dark beside her. The lamps of the estate burned pale upon the corners. Their breath rose white upon the cold air. They walked along the fresh pavements between the rows of small houses. They came to the front door of number 16 Wardlebrook Avenue. Myra put her key in the lock. She turned it. She opened the door and stepped inside. David waited in the small hall a moment. He heard voices from the front room. He heard a sudden, terrible sound. It was a sound he had never heard before. It was a sound like a heavy tool striking wood, and yet not wood. It was followed by a scream, high and short, cut off before it could finish. Myra called out to him from the doorway of the front room. She said his name. She said, "Come and help. Ian is doing him." David stepped into the room. What he saw upon the floor of that small front parlour would remain with him for the rest of his life. A young man lay upon the carpet near the sofa. He was thin and dark-haired and dressed in a plain shirt and narrow trousers. His name was Edward Evans. He was 17 years old. He was an apprentice engineer at a small works in the city. He had met Brady earlier that evening at Manchester Central Station. He had come home with the pair in the small hired car for a drink and a talk. He had sat, only a few minutes before, upon the sofa with a bottle of wine. He was now upon the floor, and there was blood upon the carpet, and Brady stood above him with an axe in his hand. The axe was small, the kind kept in a coal shed to split kindling. It had a short wooden handle and a heavy blade. Brady swung it again. He swung it a third time, and a fourth. The blows fell with a slow, patient rhythm. He said something quiet under his breath after each one. The young man on the floor did not cry out any more. His limbs still moved a little. Brady set the axe down. He took a length of electrical flex from a chair. He wrapped it about the young man's throat. He pulled it tight. He held it. He counted, quiet, under his breath. The young man was still. David Smith stood in the doorway of the front room. He did not move. He did not speak. His face had turned the colour of the ash upon the grate. His hands hung empty at his sides. Brady looked up at him. Brady smiled, a small, thin smile. Brady said, "That is the messiest one yet." Brady said, "It took longer than it should have." Brady handed him a cloth. Brady said, "Help me clean up." David took the cloth. He did as he was told. He did not know, later, why he had done so. He would say, in a courtroom in the spring to come, that he had been afraid. He would say that the axe was still upon the floor, and that Myra was in the room, and that he had thought, if he did not help, he might be the next one upon the carpet. He knelt down beside the young man's body. He wiped the blood from the wooden floor at the edge of the rug. He wiped the blood from a small patch of wallpaper near the skirting board. His hands shook. His stomach turned inside him. He did not weep. He did not then weep. Brady and Myra wrapped the young man's body in a length of thick polythene sheeting. They wound it tight with cord. They dragged the bundle up the narrow stairs to a small bedroom at the back of the house. They laid it upon the floor of the room. They shut the door. Brady spoke, calm, of what would come next. He said the moor was too wet that night. He said they would take the body up the next day, when the rain had passed. He said David should come back in the morning, with the old pram from his flat, to help carry the bundle down to the car. David nodded. His mouth was dry. His voice would not come. Brady poured him a glass of wine. Myra made a pot of tea. The old grandmother was upstairs in her own room, deep in her sleep, and she had heard nothing. The wireless played a soft, late tune from a chapel hall in London. The clock upon the mantel ticked slow. David sat, quiet, upon the edge of the small sofa. His hands still trembled upon his knees. He drank the wine to keep his face steady. He waited, as long as he could, for Brady to say he might go. At last, near 3 o'clock in the morning, Brady walked him to the front door. Brady clapped him on the shoulder. Brady said, "Well done, lad." Brady said, "We shall have a proper drink of it in the morning." David stepped out into the wet dark. The rain still hushed upon the pavement. The lamps of the estate burned pale upon the corners. He walked, slow at first, along the fresh concrete. He walked past the small saplings tied to their stakes. He walked past the rows of dark windows. When he was out of sight of the house, he began to run. He ran the short distance to his own front door, He fumbled his key in the lock. He fell into the small hall of the flat. He was sick upon the floor. Maureen came out of the bedroom in her nightgown, with her hair loose upon her shoulders. She saw his face. She saw the wetness upon his coat. She saw the terror in his eyes. She asked him, small and afraid, what had happened. He could not at first say the words. He sat upon the kitchen chair with his head in his hands. He wept, at last, in a hard, breaking sob. He told her. Maureen listened. She listened to every word. She listened to the axe and the flex and the young man on the floor and the bundle upstairs in the small back bedroom of her sister's house. Her face grew still and white. She did not cry out. She did not ask him if it was true. She had lived, in her own quiet way, near enough to the small house on Wardlebrook Avenue for long enough to know that it was true. She sat down upon the kitchen chair opposite her husband. She put her small hand upon his. She said in a low, plain voice that he must go to the police. David lifted his head. He looked at her. He was afraid. He had helped to clean the blood from the wooden floor. He had knelt beside the body. He had drunk the wine at the small kitchen table afterwards. He did not know what a court might make of a young man who had done such things and then walked home to his flat. Maureen said, again, in the same low, plain voice, that he must go. She said Brady would come for him next. She said Brady would come for both of them. She said they had a life, still, that might yet be lived. She said, go now. They took a bread knife and a screwdriver from the kitchen drawer. They held them tight in their coat pockets. They stepped out of the front door of the flat into the last hour before the dawn. The rain had eased. The wind moved cold along the pavements. They did not walk in the direction of Wardlebrook Avenue. They walked the other way, toward the small parade of shops at the edge of the estate. There was a public telephone kiosk on the corner. It stood in a pale pool of lamplight. David pulled open its heavy red door. He lifted the black receiver. His hand was steady, at last. He asked the operator, in a plain, low voice, for the police. He gave his name. He gave his address. He said there had been a murder. He said the body was in a small house on Wardlebrook Avenue, in an upstairs back bedroom. He said the man who had done it was called Ian Brady. He said his own name was David Smith, and that he had seen it done, and that he was frightened. The voice at the other end of the line was calm and patient. It asked him to wait where he was. It said a car would come. The car came, in a short time, along the wet street. 2 officers stepped out into the pale lamplight of the shop parade. They were in plain clothes. They wore heavy overcoats. They took the young couple to the small station at Hyde. They took a long, careful statement. They telephoned a senior officer at his home. They telephoned another man in the borough force. They telephoned a superintendent named Robert Talbot, who was known in that district as a steady, deliberate policeman. At 8:30 upon the morning of the 7th of October, Superintendent Talbot stood at the front door of the small house on Wardlebrook Avenue. He wore a butcher's white coat over his uniform, borrowed from a bread van at the corner, so that no eye should mark him as a policeman from the far end of the road. He knocked upon the door. Myra Hindley opened it, in her housecoat, with a mug of tea in her hand. He asked, in a plain, quiet voice, if he might come in. He asked to see her husband. She said Ian was not her husband. She said he was upstairs, in the small back bedroom, writing a letter. Talbot climbed the narrow stairs. He opened the door of the small back bedroom. He saw Brady in his shirt-sleeves upon the bed, with a pen and a sheet of paper in his hand. He saw, upon the floor near the wall, a long bundle wrapped in a thick sheet of polythene, wound tight with cord. He did not for a long moment take his eyes from it. He turned to Brady. He said, quiet, that he would like to know what was in the bundle upon the floor. Brady laid his pen down. Brady looked at him, calm, with his cool blue eyes. Brady said only one small sentence. He said, Eddie and I had a bit of a row last night. The bundle was opened, in a careful and dreadful way, upon the floor of that small bedroom. Edward Evans lay inside it, still in his plain shirt and narrow trousers. Brady was taken away in the plain black police car that morning, in handcuffs, without a word further to the officers. Myra Hindley was taken away 4 days later, once other men had knocked at other doors, and once other statements had been taken, and once other small facts had been gathered from the neighbours upon the fresh, pale row of the estate. The old grandmother sat by the fire in her housecoat, and did not, for a long while, seem to understand what had happened in her own front room. In the days and weeks that followed, other officers began to walk the wide, wet shoulder of Saddleworth Moor. They walked in long, slow lines. They carried spades. They carried maps upon which small crosses had been marked from the photographs found in a suitcase at the left luggage office at Manchester Central Station. They walked in the cold October wind, with the peat soft beneath their heavy boots, and the low sky above them, and the curlew crying now and again in the wet air. And in the small houses of Gorton and Ashton and Longsight and Ancoats, mothers who had waited many long months at their front windows began, one by one, to hear a slow, heavy knock upon their own front doors, and to open them to grave-faced men, with folded caps in their hands, and to know, at last, in the small parlour by the fire, what the wind above the moor had kept for them all along. The trial at Chester Assizes. The spring of 1966 came slow and pale to the county of Cheshire. The frost had lifted at last from the low fields. The hedges along the small lanes began to show a soft, cautious green. The rain that had fallen for weeks turned to a lighter, patient drizzle. The chapels of the small towns rang their bells for the Easter morning. In the city of Chester, the old walls stood grey above the river, and the crooked black and white houses leaned above the narrow rows, and the swans moved slow upon the Dee beneath the stone arches of the bridge. The assize court stood at the top of Grosvenor Street, within the walls of the old Norman castle. It was a wide, plain building of pale stone, with a heavy portico held upon tall columns, and a set of broad steps rising from the yard. Its courtroom was oak-panelled and high-ceilinged. Its benches were dark with the polish of many years. Its windows were tall and narrow, and the pale spring light fell through them in long, thin bars upon the floor. It was a place where the great trials of the county had been held for many generations. It was a place where grave voices had passed grave sentences upon grave men. On the morning of the 19th of April, a Tuesday, the trial of Ian Brady and Myra Hindley opened at Chester Assizes. The queues had begun to form before dawn. Men and women stood in heavy coats along the pavement outside the castle gate. They stamped their feet against the cold. They held small flasks of tea in their gloved hands. They spoke in low voices of what they had read in the papers. Reporters from London and Manchester and further off stood among them with notebooks and press cards. Photographers waited upon the steps with their heavy cameras and their bulbs. Inside the courtroom, the benches filled slow and quiet. The clerks moved back and forth between the tables. The barristers came in through a side door in their dark gowns and their white horsehair wigs. The judge's dais stood empty at the head of the room, beneath a great carved coat of arms. The dock stood in the centre of the floor, high-sided and boxed in with dark wood, with a small stair leading down from it to the cells below. The jury box stood to one side, 12 empty seats in a long row, waiting for the 12 men and women who would be sworn in that morning. The judge was Mr. Justice Fenton Atkinson. He was a lean, grave man of some 60 years, with a long, careful face and steady eyes. He was known upon the Northern Circuit as a fair man, patient in his rulings, exact in his summing up. He would sit through the whole trial without ever raising his voice. He would keep, upon a plain sheet of paper before him, a careful set of notes in a neat, small hand. He would say, at the end, that some evidence in the case must be heard by no ear that had not been trained to hear it, and that he wished, if it were possible, that he might have spared the jury the hearing of it. The prosecution was led by the Attorney General, Sir Elwyn Jones. He was a Welshman, small and precise, with a voice that carried well in a large room. He had stood, some 20 years before, at the trials in a foreign city called Nuremberg, and he had put questions to men in grey uniforms who had ordered the ruin of a continent. He now stood in the wood-panelled court at Chester with a plain grey folder before him, and he opened it and he began, in a low, careful voice, to lay out the case for the Crown. He spoke first of the young man Edward Evans, killed with an axe upon the floor of a small front parlour in Hattersley. He spoke of the witness David Smith, who had knelt beside the body upon that carpet. He spoke of the police who had come at daybreak to the house at Wardlebrook Avenue. He spoke, then, of 2 other children. He spoke of Lesley Ann Downey, 10 years old, taken from a small funfair upon a piece of waste ground in Ancoats. He spoke of John Kilbride, 12 years old, taken from the closing stalls of a market square at Ashton-under-Lyne. He spoke of the wide, dark shoulder of Saddleworth Moor, and of the small graves that had been opened in the wet peat by patient men with spades in the cold October wind. The 2 prisoners sat in the high-sided dock. Brady wore a plain grey suit. His dark hair was combed back from his high forehead. His cool blue eyes moved slow about the room. He kept his hands folded before him. He kept his face still. He did not shift in his seat. He looked, at times, at the ceiling. He looked, at times, at the notes upon the small ledge before him. He did not look at the witnesses. He did not look at the jury. He did not look at the public gallery. Hindley wore a plain black skirt and a pale wool jacket. Her hair, once bleached almost white, had been allowed to darken a little in the months of her remand. It was combed straight back from her broad, careful face. She kept her mouth tight. She kept her hands folded upon her lap. She listened, at all times, with a small, watchful attention. She turned her head, now and again, toward Brady beside her. She did not weep. She did not tremble. She sat as one sits who has decided, long before the trial began, upon the manner in which she shall be seen. The witnesses came, one by one, to the small oaken stand at the side of the court. David Smith came in his narrow tie and his best dark jacket. His hands shook a little upon the rail. He gave his evidence in a plain, low voice. He spoke of the axe and the flex and the young man upon the carpet. He spoke of the cloth pressed into his hand and the wine poured into his glass and the long walk home through the rain. He was cross-examined for many hours. His own troubles were laid out before the jury, his old fights, his old fines, his own dark writings in the small blue notebook. He held to his account. He did not shift from what he had said. His voice grew tired. It did not grow small. The mothers came too. Sheila Kilbride came from Ashton, in her plain black coat. She sat in the witness box with her handkerchief pressed tight in her hand. She spoke of a boy of 12 in a warm woolen coat, gone from a wet market square on a November afternoon. Winnie Johnson came from Longsight, in a thin grey jacket. She spoke of a boy of 12 in a pale blue shirt and small round spectacles, gone from a pavement upon Stockport Road on a June evening. Anne West came from Ancoats, small and shaking, in a dark headscarf. She spoke of a little girl of 10 in a red tartan skirt and a pale blue coat, gone from a Boxing Day fair upon a piece of waste ground on Hume Hall Lane. Each mother, when her few questions were done, was led gently down from the stand by an usher. Each passed close to the high-sided dock. Each looked, once, at the 2 figures within. Neither prisoner returned the look. The great weight of the trial fell, in its middle days, upon the reel of magnetic tape. It had been found in a small suitcase at the left luggage office of Manchester Central Station, along with photographs of a country lane above Saddleworth. The tape was of a kind used for the recording of music at home. It had been laced onto a small machine set up upon a table at the front of the court. The Attorney General rose, quiet. He said the tape ran for some 16 minutes. He said the court would hear the voice of a child. He said no words of his own could stand between the jury and what they were about to hear. He asked the clerk to press the button. The reels began to turn. The plain, small voice of Lesley Ann Downey filled the wood-panelled court. The room grew very still. The pale spring light fell in long, thin bars across the floor. The reporters set down their pens. The mothers in the public gallery pressed handkerchiefs to their mouths. A juror closed his eyes. Another looked down at the wooden rail before him and did not lift his head again for many minutes. The judge sat unmoving upon the high bench with his own hand upon his brow. Anne West, in the front row of the gallery, gave a small, broken cry and was led out by an usher into the corridor beyond. The tape ran to its end. The reels turned upon empty air for a long moment before the clerk lifted his hand to the switch. There was no cough in the court, no shift of feet upon the boards. The silence was the silence of a chapel after a long, hard hymn has died away. The Attorney-General sat down. He did not speak again for many minutes. The judge at last, in a voice low and even, called for a short recess. The court rose. Men and women filed out into the corridors with their heads bent. Some stood at the windows and looked out at the pale sky above the castle yard. Some walked in the cloisters and did not speak at all. In the days that followed, Brady was called to the witness stand. He climbed the small step in his plain grey suit. He took the oath in a low, careful voice. He answered the questions of his counsel, Mr. Emlyn Hewson, in short, exact phrases. He spoke of his childhood in Glasgow, of his foster family, of the small kirk on Sundays, of the books he had read in his rented room in Longsight. He denied, in a flat and level tone, that he had struck any blow upon a small boy in a market square. He said only that he had known Edward Evans, and that a quarrel had ended badly upon the floor of a small parlour, and that David Smith had been present, and had helped, and had lied afterwards to save himself. The Attorney-General rose to cross-examine him. He was quiet. He was slow. He turned the pages of the small notebook before him with a careful finger. He asked Brady about the tape. He asked Brady about the photographs of a country lane above the moor. He asked Brady about a small strip of black and white images of a child upon a bed. He asked Brady, in a low, level voice, why a man might photograph such a scene, and keep such a scene, and store it in a suitcase at a railway station in the heart of a great city. Brady answered in single, careful sentences. He said the photographs were of no importance. He said the tape was of no importance. He said the child had walked in and walked out, and that other matters, later that night, had been of no concern of his. Hindley was called next. She wore, that day, a plain wool jumper and a dark skirt. Her hair had been combed and pinned. She stood at the small oaken stand and gave her oath in a low, plain voice. She spoke of her office at Millwards, of her walks upon Saddleworth, of the small house at Wardlebrook Avenue, and the old grandmother who slept upstairs by the fire. She said she had known no evil. She said Brady was her lover, and that she had trusted him, and that she had done such things only as he had told her to do. She said the tape had been a bad joke. She said the little girl in the tartan skirt had walked out of the house that night and gone away in a car, and that she did not know, in truth, what had happened afterwards. The Attorney-General crossed her also. He was patient. He was almost gentle. He asked her how a woman could stand by and hear the pleadings of a child of 10 and not turn her head. He asked her how a woman could sit in the small hired car upon a country road and wait, quiet, while other things were done upon the wet peat beyond the wall. He asked her whether she had truly not known, in the small house on Wardlebrook Avenue, that the low shelf held books, and the drawer held photographs, and the tin case held a reel of tape. She answered him in flat, careful sentences. She did not weep. She did not shake. Her voice grew, if anything, harder as he asked her more. The closing speeches were made upon the 5th of May. The Attorney-General spoke for many hours. He drew the whole case together in a slow, patient way. He spoke of the young man upon the parlour floor. He spoke of the little girl upon the tape. He spoke of the small boy in the market square, whose grave had been opened in the peat above Ashton. He spoke of the wider silence of the moor, and of 2 other children whose names lay heavy upon that silence. He asked the jury to hold to the plain facts. He asked them to remember the photographs and the tape and the axe. He asked them to give what verdict their consciences would allow. Mr. Justice Fenton Atkinson delivered his summing up upon the following morning. He spoke for the greater part of the day. He set out the evidence in a careful, exact voice. He told the jury they must be sure. He told them they must set aside all feeling, and hold only to what had been proved before them in the court. He warned them that the tape they had heard would trouble them for many years. He told them quiet that this was the burden of a juror in a case such as this. He sent them out at last, in the middle of the afternoon, to consider their verdicts. The jury retired at 2:30. They were gone for 2 hours and 14 minutes. They came back in a long single line and took their places in the box. The clerk asked them, in the old form of words, upon each count in turn. The foreman rose. Upon the murder of Edward Evans, both prisoners were found guilty. Upon the murder of Lesley Ann Downey, both prisoners were found guilty. Upon the murder of John Kilbride, Brady was found guilty, and Hindley was found guilty of harbouring him with knowledge. The judge sat still upon the high bench. He gave, in a quiet voice, the sentences that the law required. Brady received 3 sentences of life imprisonment. Hindley received 2 sentences of life imprisonment and a term of 7 years upon the further count. He recommended that they be held for a very long time. He said he could see no signs of remorse in either of them. The prisoners were led down from the high-sided dock. They passed through the small door at the back of it and down the narrow stair to the cells beneath. They did not look at one another. They did not look at the gallery. The court rose. Men and women filed out into the late afternoon light of the castle yard. The bells of the cathedral rang out across the roofs of the city. The swans still moved slow upon the Dee beneath the stone arches of the bridge. And above the low grey hills to the east, the wind moved on across the wide, empty country, and the peat lay soft and dark beneath the heather, and 2 small graves, still unfound, waited quiet for the years that would come, the long silence of the moor. The summer of 1966 passed slowly across the north. The papers that had carried the trial upon their front pages turned, at last, to other stories. The queues on Grosvenor Street thinned and were gone. The reporters folded their press cards and went home to their own cities. The oak-panelled court at Chester grew quiet again. The high-sided dock stood empty. The plain grey folder of the Attorney-General was tied with string and placed upon a shelf. Above the castle yard the swans still moved slow upon the Dee, and the bells of the cathedral still rang out across the roofs of the city, as if nothing at all had passed within its walls. Ian Brady was taken north to Durham Gaol. He was placed in a small cell of pale brick, with a narrow window high above the floor. He was given a plain grey uniform and a numbered card. He sat, at first, upon the edge of a narrow bed. He asked for his books. He was given a small pile of what the prison library could allow. He read, in the quiet of the long evenings, as he had read in the small back room in Longsight. He wrote long letters in his neat, tight script. He wrote of philosophy. He wrote of the Great War. He wrote of the world beyond the wall, in words as cold and careful as those he had written before. Myra Hindley was taken south to Holloway Prison in London. She was placed in a wing set apart from the common women. She was given a plain blue dress and a numbered card. She sat, at first, upon the edge of a narrow bed. She asked for a Bible. She was given a small black one, bound in cheap leather. She began, in the small hours of her cell, to turn its pages. She had left the church long before, in the small rented room in Gorton. She now returned to it, or so she wrote, in the quiet of a prison wing. She took instruction from a chaplain. She was received back into the sacraments. She wore, from that time, a small silver cross about her throat. The years began to pass. The gas lamps of Gorton were replaced with tall electric ones. The trams gave way at last to the buses. The old back-to-back houses of the small streets were pulled down row by row, and new estates rose in their place. The mills fell silent, one by one, and their chimneys were brought down with charges of gelignite in careful, quiet mornings. The children who had once played hopscotch upon the flagstones grew up, and had children of their own, and grew old. And still, in a small house upon Weil Street, and in a small house upon Smallshaw Lane, and in a small house upon Eston Street, mothers sat by their front windows in the evenings, and looked out at the quiet pavements, and did not sleep. The moor above the towns kept its long silence. The heather bloomed each August in a pale, low purple. The peat lay soft after the rain and hard after the frost. The curlews came in the spring and cried above the empty hills, and flew south again in the autumn, and were gone. Walkers passed along the narrow road at Brown Knoll. They stopped, sometimes, at a small lay-by. They looked out across the wide, rolling country. Some knew what had been done there. Some did not. The wind moved on, as it had always moved, across the low waves of grass. In the small house on Wardlebrook Avenue, the old grandmother had gone away in the days after the arrests. She had been taken in by other family. She had died, quiet, not long afterwards. The council had painted the front door a different colour. New tenants had come and gone and come again. Neighbours upon the fresh row spoke, in low voices, of the small house at the end. Children upon the estate dared one another to walk past it in the dark. In time, the council took the decision to pull it down altogether. The bricks were carted away. The small front garden was smoothed over with fresh turf. A wide, empty gap stood in the middle of the row. Through the long years of the 1970s, letters passed between Durham and Holloway. Brady wrote to Hindley in his neat, tight script. Hindley wrote to Brady in her plain, careful hand. In time, the letters slowed. In time, they stopped. Hindley wrote instead to a young prison officer named Patricia Cairns and to other friends beyond the walls. She wrote to members of Parliament. She wrote to Home Secretaries. She wrote to a young peer of the House of Lords, Lord Longford, who came to visit her in his soft grey suit, and who spoke, in his gentle way, of forgiveness and reform. She began to campaign for her release. She said she was a changed woman. She said she had been young. She said she had been in the thrall of a colder man. She said the years had made a stranger of the girl who had sat at the black underwood typewriter in the office at Millwards. The mothers of the Moor did not agree. Sheila Kilbride wrote her own letters, in a plain, tired hand. Winnie Johnson wrote hers. Anne West wrote hers. Each said that her child had not walked out from the moor to grow old and change her ways. Each said that no letter to a peer, no Bible upon a shelf, no silver cross about a throat, could give back what had been taken from a wet market square, or a warm Boxing Day fair, or a narrow pavement upon Stockport Road. The papers printed their words. The Home Secretaries read them. No door of a prison wing was opened. In the summer of 1985, Brady was moved from Gartree Prison in Leicestershire to a hospital for the criminally insane. It was called Park Lane and later Ashworth, and it stood in the low fields near Liverpool. He was given a small room with a bed and a table. He was given a set of paints and a pile of paper. He was seen by the doctors each week. He was told he was ill in his mind. He did not at first agree. In time, in his own quiet way, he came to accept it, or to seem to accept it. He wrote a small book of his own upon the great murderers of the last 100 years. He wrote it in his neat, tight script. He signed the copies when they came to him with a cold and careful hand. That same summer, a small piece appeared in a Sunday paper. It carried a photograph long kept in a police file. It showed Myra Hindley, in a wool coat, standing upon a stretch of Saddleworth Moor, holding a small pram. The pram was empty. The photograph had been taken by Brady in the winter of 1963. It had lain unread among the reels of black and white film in the small suitcase from the left luggage office at Manchester Central Station. Its meaning had not, at the time of the trial, been understood. Now, in a room within the walls of a great London newspaper, a reporter set it upon a table beside a map of the moor. He turned to a policeman at his side. He said, quiet, that the pram had been standing upon a grave. The story ran the next Sunday. The police reopened the file. A Detective Chief Superintendent, Peter Topping, was placed in charge of a fresh search. He was a patient man. He walked the moor. He read the old statements. He read the old maps. He wrote, at last, to Myra Hindley in her prison wing. He asked, in a plain, quiet voice, whether she might now speak of what she had never spoken of in the court at Chester. She wrote back. She said she would. In the December of 1986, and again in the March of the year that followed, Hindley was driven north from a prison in Cookham Wood to the wide, dark shoulder of Saddleworth Moor. She wore a dark coat and a pale headscarf. She sat between two women officers in the back of a plain black car. She was taken along the narrow road at Brown Knoll. She was asked to look out at the country. She was asked to remember. She walked, slow, upon the wet peat. She stood a long time in the wind. She pointed, at times, at a stretch of heather. She said, in a low, careful voice, that she was not sure. She said the country had changed. She said the roads had been widened. She said, at the end of the long day, that she could not, in truth, find the place. That summer, Brady was driven north from Ashworth. He too was taken along the narrow road at Brown Knoll. He too walked upon the wet peat, thin and grey now, with the years heavy upon him. He too pointed, at times, at a stretch of heather. He too said, at the end of the long day, that he could not be sure. Yet in the July of 1987, patient men with spades and dogs and small metal probes opened the peat in a place near Shiny Brook. They found, at last, the body of Pauline Reed. Her small pink shoes were still upon her feet. Her mother, Joan, was told upon a Saturday morning in the small house on Weil Street. She wept, quiet, into her tea towel. She had waited 24 years to know. The search for Keith Bennett went on. The men walked the moor for many summers more. They probed the peat at Hograin and Shiny Brook, and along the wet edges of the Wessenden Head Road. The dogs sniffed at the wind. The maps grew thick with small pencil marks. Winnie Johnson came, in her thin grey coat, and stood at the edge of the country, and looked out across the low waves of grass, and did not turn her face away. She came in every season. She came in the cold rain and in the hard sun. She said she would keep coming, until she found her boy. Brady, in his room at Ashworth, wrote long letters to her. He said he might, if he were only taken back to the moor once more, know at last the place. He said he might, if certain conditions were met, tell what he knew. The conditions were not met. The letters grew stranger. He began in the 1990s to refuse his food. He was fed, in the end, through a small tube by the doctors. He wrote of it in his neat, tight script. He said he wished to die. He was not allowed to die. Hindley, in her prison wing, grew slowly older. Her hair, once bleached almost white, went grey at the temples. She wore, in her later photographs, a plain wool jumper and a plain skirt. She wrote her long letters. She hoped, still, to walk out through the gate one day. In the November of 2002, in the small hospital at Bury St Edmunds, she died, quiet, of a bronchial illness. She was 60 years old. The papers printed her old prison photograph upon their front pages. The old prison photograph was the one that had followed her, unchanging, through every one of the long years. Anne West did not live to see it. She had died some years before, worn out at last by the long grief. Sheila Kilbride lived on in the small house at Ashton, and kept the picture of her boy upon the mantel, and passed away in her own time. Winnie Johnson walked the moor for many years more. She stood, in her thin grey coat, at the edge of the low, empty country. She spoke, in her plain Manchester voice, to any reporter who would listen. She said she would not go until her boy was found. She died in the August of 2012. Her boy had not been found. Brady lived on at Ashworth. He grew thin. His hair went white. He kept, upon a small shelf beside his bed, a plain row of dark books, much as he had kept once, long before, upon the low shelf in a rented back room in Longsight. He died there in the May of 2017. He was 79 years old. His ashes were taken out to sea from a small port on the Mersey, in the middle of a quiet night, and were scattered upon the black water beyond the sight of any coast. The moor above the towns kept its long silence. The heather bloomed again in the pale, low purple of another August. The peat lay soft after the rain and hard after the frost. The curlews came again in the spring, and cried above the empty hills, and flew south again in the autumn, and were gone. Walkers still passed along the narrow road at Brown Knoll. Some stopped. Some looked out across the wide, rolling country. Some knew what had been done there. Some did not. The wind moved on, as it had always moved, across the low waves of grass. And so we leave them there, at the end of a long night's telling, the mothers who waited by their windows, the children who did not come home, the two who did what was done and passed at last through the gates of a Chester courtroom and out into the long, grey years beyond. Let us think of Pauline in her pink party dress, and of John in his warm woolen coat, and of Keith in his round steel spectacles, and of Lesley Ann in her red tartan skirt. Let us think of them, not as they were left, but as they were loved, in the small warm parlours of the northern streets. In the last summer they were still alive. The candle burned low. The chamber fell silent. The rain moved on across the heather. And history, once again, turned the page in the dark.